Chapter 548. The updates are not stable. I said it at the beginning of the month. Who doesn't have something important in life? On the first day, I made it clear that there were not many updates this month. I thought I was being sincere and asked everyone to give their votes to other writers. Unexpectedly, there were still so many people talking about this. It was fine to talk about it, but there were still a few people who went around yelling about what they wanted. Why do this? Why do this? It's not easy for everyone. Let's all be more tolerant. Someone didn't know who it was, but she was trembling under the black dagger that carried the faint scent of blood. She looked delicate and pitiful. Her two curved brows were slightly furrowed, and she held her heart in her hands. This girl looked unfamiliar and weak. Fan Xian didn't know her, but he didn't feel any pity for her. Looking at this deathly pale girl, he opened her mouth to call for help. His left hand quickly covered her mouth. Immediately after, his fingertip flicked, preparing to seal her meridians and temporarily stop her from moving. However, before his fingertip made contact, Fan Xian was surprised to find that the unfamiliar girl he had restrained had fainted with a moan in his palm. Fan Xian was startled. His finger pressed gently on the girl's neck to confirm that she had truly fainted and was not faking it. He couldn't help but slowly withdraw his hand and put her down on the chair. He looked at his finger and furrowed his brows. He hadn't even had time to apply the drug, so how could this girl have fainted? The wrinkles between his brows had not disappeared because Fan Xian had been listening attentively to the shouts outside the manor. He listened quietly, ready at any moment for the people chasing him to enter the manor to carry out the next step. Unexpectedly, the clamor outside the manor did not last long. After a few words of negotiation, the soldiers chasing him left. Fan Xian was slightly surprised. He walked to the side of the window and looked toward the front door of the manor. He furrowed his brows and wondered who exactly lived in this manor for the eldest princess faction to trust it so much. Who could avoid the search of the Jingdo government at such an unusual time? Although this manor took up a lot of space, looking at the style, it did not belong to any royal family. It was probably the residence of some official in court. He frowned and thought for a long time, but he couldn't remember which minister on the eldest princess side lived in this street. Although he did not guess the owner of this manor, since the pursuers had left, Fan Xian relaxed slightly. Only then did he have some spare time to observe the room he was in. It would have been fine if he hadn't looked, but now that he did, Fan Xian couldn't help but be shocked. It was just like when he had first recognized the boudoir as a study and suddenly met that strange young lady. This was because, this boudoir was filled with bookshelves full of books. It did not look like the boudoir of a young lady at all. There wasn't even a bit of needlework. What's more, on the two pillars on either side of the desk were two very familiar couplets. The tender cold locks one's dreams because of the cold spring, and the fragrant wine covers one's body. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and couldn't help but look at the unconscious young lady in the chair. He thought to himself that this was not appropriate. This couplet was written by Qin Guan, a scholar of the Song dynasty in that world. And the reason it appeared in this world, in this young lady's boudoir, was because of Fan Xian's handwritten copy of Dream of the Red Chamber. This couplet had once appeared in Qin Keqing's room in the book. The reason Fan Xian thought it was not appropriate was because Qin Keqing was such a charming and romantic person, a person whose spring dreams were scattered like clouds. This couplet in the room matched her character. This couplet, the young lady in the chair, and the scholarly atmosphere of the boudoir did not match well. The bookshelves were densely packed with books, which was the second reason for Fan Xian's shock. There were no female biographies on the shelves, no schoolwork for the girls' school, and no poems and biographies of the world's most widely circulated poems. What was on display was the Banxian's High Poetry Collection. There were various editions of the Banxian's High Poetry Collection, especially the edition personally annotated by Master Zhuang Mohan. There were 3 sets of it. There were also 3 whole rows of Zhuang's classics and histories, personally edited by Fan Xian a year ago and published by the Imperial College. These were the results of some of the books in the carriage. And on the bookshelves was Dream of the Red Chamber, or Story of the Stone. There were various editions of Story of the Stone, some long, some short, some exquisite, some crude. Most of them were editions published by Donghua Bookstore in the past 3 years, but there were also some works from unknown bookstores. Fan Xian stood in a daze in front of the bookshelves, looking at the books that emitted the faint scent of ink. For some reason, he sank into silence. He didn't know which family this unconscious young lady belonged to, nor did he know why this young lady valued the brush and ink she had left in this world so much. Faintly, Fan Xian lightly sniffed, as if he had completely forgotten that he was in a dangerous place in the capital and that he was in the middle of a bloody conspiracy. He only calmly looked at the books. For a moment, he suddenly felt very satisfied. People would always die. He had lived twice and had 2 completely different lives. It had already surpassed the gifts of the Creator. Furthermore, he had already left behind these words and spiritual things in this world of the Qing kingdom. Even if he died today, how many regrets would he have? The words were not his, and the spiritual wealth was also not his. However, all of this was something he had brought from that world and gifted to this world. Fan Xian suddenly felt a bit proud. Proud to be a bridge and proud to have left behind some traces. Perhaps this was very similar to the sentiments Yi Qingmei had when she changed this world. Outside the window, it was already night. Only the silver light from the sky shone in. People in this era always ate very early. This young lady was probably used to being alone, so during this time, not a single serving girl or servant came into the room to greet her. On the contrary, it gave Fan Xian a rare moment of solitude and reflection. At this time, he had already gotten rid of the emotion that suddenly appeared before. He walked to the desk and looked at the fresh ink on the snow-white rice paper on the desk. He looked at some fragmentary words copied on the paper, and he couldn't help but reveal a rather elusive smile on his lips. The zhenqi in his body was abundant, and his senses were extraordinary. Naturally, he did not need to light a candle, and he did not need to worry about outsiders finding out. They all say that authors are crazy. Who understands? Fan Xian looked at the words on the paper and spoke to himself. He thought to himself that this young lady was truly a crazy person. Looking at the beautiful and spirited handwriting on the paper, perhaps this young lady had some inner wisdom. Out of the corner of his eye, he suddenly saw a smear of red in the compartment at the side of the desk. Curiously, he extended his hand and took it out. It was not a thick book. The cover was a wordless red cover about 8 inches long. Fan Xian's fingers gently lifted the cover and saw the words, "Feng Yu Treasure Mirror," written on the title page. Involuntarily, he felt a great deal of emotion. It was this book. He remembered when he had first entered Jingdo. In front of Yisher Tavern, he had bought this copy of Dream of the Red Chamber from the hands of the woman selling children. It was one of the first pirated copies in this world. Fan Xian looked at the book in his hand in a daze. He had not thought that he would reunite with an old friend here. In an instant, years of life in Jingdo and Jiangnan floated through his mind like fleeting light and shadows. He didn't know what to say. Gradually, he understood that even if he was reborn, he would still not be a match for Jingdo's fame and fortune. He had long forgotten his original bright state of mind. He had long lost that free and easy life. I wonder which manor this young lady is from. He pondered this in his heart. Holding the book in his hand, he unconsciously looked toward the face of the young lady in the chair. Only now did he realize that this young lady was very delicate and pretty. The skin on her face was particularly clean, and there was an inexplicable coldness between her brows. She looked like the snow on Tsang Mountain, almost reflecting light. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly and couldn't help but think of his sister Ruoruo, who was always as cold as ice in front of outsiders, and his wife Wan, who was currently trapped in the palace. This young lady's still cold demeanor in her unconsciousness seemed to occupy some of Ruoruo's and Wan's energy. Fan Xian gazed at the young lady's face with a smile. Suddenly, he noticed that the young lady's eyelids moved slightly. He knew that she was finally going to wake up. Sun Pin slowly woke up. She felt that her eyelids were as heavy as lead stones. She only remembered that after she ate, she had returned to her room to rest. She was going to carefully copy the poem again and burn it in the garden to worship the emperor the next day. Unexpectedly, there was a ruckus outside the manor. It seemed that the people of the Jingdo government were capturing a criminal. Then, that man charged in. That black dagger was cold. That pair of hands had such a heavy smell of blood and a thick smell of a man's body. Sun Pin had never been treated so rudely in her life. The smell of sweat from the hands covering her mouth and nose assaulted her. She couldn't help but feel embarrassed and angry at the same time. Unable to breathe, she fainted. After fainting for an indeterminable amount of time, she finally woke up and slowly opened her eyes. In a daze, she saw a face. It was the face of a handsome and amiable young man looking at her with a hateful smile. There were no lights in the room. There was only the faint moonlight outside the window. However, it made this face appear even purer and gentler. Sun Pin's heart tightened. Her eyes were filled with terror. Unconsciously, she shrank back into the chair. Just as she was about to open her mouth to call out, the terror in her eyes turned into a sense of loss and helplessness. Her heart thumped as she wondered who exactly this young man was. He didn't look like she knew him, but why did he look so familiar? It was as if she had seen him a long time ago. Fan Xian was a bit surprised to see the young lady in the chair slowly open her eyes. A complicated emotion flashed through her eyes, but she didn't cry out. He looked at her with a slight smile and pulled back the finger he had prepared to strike. He didn't prepare any drugs because he needed a sober hostage. "Who are you? Who are you?" The two of them spoke at the same time. Fan Xian tilted his head slightly and raised his brows. "Shouldn't I be a criminal?" Sun Pin looked at this good-looking young man and was slightly startled. She kept feeling that his brows were filled with gentleness. He didn't look like a criminal at all. However, she also knew that her reaction was truly strange. She couldn't help but feel a wave of shame and panic. Her hands guarded in front of her body. In a trembling voice, she said, "I don't care who you are, but please don't do anything rash. This will not do you any good." "Miss, you are very calm. I admire that very much." Fan Xian gazed at her with a warm gaze. Gently, he said, "I'm afraid that once the young lady of a normal family wakes up, she will cry out loudly. Then, it will bring about tragic consequences that we do not wish to see. Your ability to control yourself is so strong that I truly admire it." Sun Pin's face heated slightly. Thinking of how she had been about to cry out earlier, she saw this face she had vaguely seen in her previous life. For some reason, she didn't cry out. "Miss, there is no need to panic. I just need a place to temporarily hide. I promise I won't hurt you," Fan Xian said quietly. He gently placed the red-covered story of the stone in his hand on the table. He could have drugged this young lady, but he had a premonition in the depths of his heart that talking more with this young lady might bring him great benefits. "Hide?" Sun Pin lowered her head in fear and glanced at the intruder's clothing out of the corner of her eye. She wondered who exactly this person was. Who was he hiding from? Suddenly, she thought of the major event that had happened in Jingdo these 2 days and the rumored appearance of that person. She then glanced at the story of the stone that person had gently placed on the table. Sun Pin's face instantly paled. It wasn't that she was smart, nor was it that she was lucky. Instead, in the past few years, her heart had always been occupied by that name. She was constantly concerned about that person's every move. Especially recently, that person had been thrown into a bottomless abyss and became a traitor that everyone wanted to kill. This made her feel extremely pained. Thus, she was able to immediately associate that person with that person and make the guess that was closest to the truth. Is it him? Sun Pin's lips trembled slightly. Bravely, she raised her head and looked seriously at Fan Xian's face. In the end, she couldn't say anything. Fan Xian glanced at her with some curiosity and asked warmly, "Young lady, may I ask which family you are from?" Sun Pin had already decided that this person was the person. Her emotions were agitated, so how could she speak? She only stared dumbly at Fan Xian and asked in a trembling voice, "Are you Sir Fan Jr.?" Thus, it was Fan Xian's turn to be dumbfounded. Although his disguise was not too exaggerated, he firmly believed that people who did not know him well would not be able to recognize him. So, how had this young lady recognized him at a glance and called out his name? Fan Xian's heart tightened. His gaze became cold. Seeing that he did not deny it, Sun Pin panicked even more. Only now did she remember the question he had asked earlier. Biting her lower lip, she timidly said, "My father is Sun Jingxiu." Sun Jingxiu. Fan Xian sucked in a cold breath and couldn't resist rubbing his nose. His mouth was wide open, but he couldn't speak for a moment. He sighed in his heart. He didn't know if his luck was extremely good or extremely bad. Sun Jingxiu. The present Jingdo magistrate. He controlled the bailiffs and daily security in Jingdo. He was the main official who had been ordered by the Empress Dowager to capture him. Unexpectedly, he had hidden in the Sun Manor and captured Sun Jingxiu's daughter. Fan Xian sighed and gazed at the young lady of the Sun family. "So, it is young lady Sunday. I hope I didn't startle you." His brows furrowed. Sun Jingxiu was now a second-level Jingdo magistrate. Although he had never been divided into factions, he had no connection to Fan Xian, particularly since the Empress Dowager trusted him so much. If Fan Xian continued to stay in the manor, it would be no different from being in a tiger's den. For safety's sake, it was best for him to leave early. Glancing at the young lady of the Sun family, Fan Xian secretly extended a finger and picked up the fragrance that had once enchanted Sea Lily, Xiaofan, and Yan Bingyun. He prepared to enchant the young lady of the Sun family and then quietly leave. "Are you Sir Fan Jr.?" Sun Pin bit her lower lip and persistently asked. Fan Xian stood in front of her with a mysterious smile on his face. Curious, he asked, "How did you recognize me at a glance?" Sun Pin heard his disguised acknowledgement and covered her mouth in disbelief. For some reason, 2 drops of tears slid down from the corners of her eyes. Fan Xian shook his head in confusion. Sun Pin saw that he was preparing to leave and immediately sat up from the chair. Throwing herself at him, she hugged him tightly in her arms. Feeling the soft fragrance fill his body, Fan Xian was truly dumbstruck. Was this young lady of the Sun family a patriotic young woman who was prepared to risk her life to capture him, a criminal who had assassinated the emperor? No, the girl in his arms was crying. It didn't seem like she was going to capture him. Then, what exactly did she want to do? Fan Xian circulated his jinqi to his hands. He didn't pull on her shoulders. He only felt the twitching of her shoulders and couldn't help but feel puzzled. This seemed to have sunk into some kind of problem between a man and a woman. Fan Xian's memory was astonishing. He had never owed a woman named Sun in his life. In reality, he had never seen her before. "Baoyu." Sun Pin sobbed in Fan Xian's arms. Suddenly, she said the word as if she was sleep-talking. Fan Xian's heart jumped and he pushed her away from his arms. In a quiet voice, he said, "Miss, wake up." After waking up, Sun Pin woke up. With a cry, she immediately retreated. Thinking of how she had so shamelessly thrown herself into the arms of a strange man, she couldn't help feeling happy, shocked, embarrassed, and angry. She sat on the chair and began to sob. Fan Xian looked at this scene and couldn't help furrowing his brows. He seemed to have faintly caught onto something. The Jingdo magistrate? The young lady of the Sun family? The room full of Dream of the Red Chamber, the Banxian's high poetry anthology, the young lady's unintentional call of Baoyu earlier. In a flash, Fan Xian finally remembered something from long ago. It was a story that had once caused much discussion in Jingdo. "You're the one who burned my Baoyu." Fan Xian looked at the young lady of the Sun family and spoke in shock. Sun Pin was recognized by Fan Xian and couldn't help being surprised. She lowered her head and glanced at him shyly. This was a story Fan Xizha had told Fan Xian 3.5 years ago. At the time, the two brothers were preparing to start the Danbo bookstore and sell Fan Xian's handwritten copy of Dream of the Red Chamber. Fan Xian was worried about the sales of Story of the Stone. Fan Xizha told him not to worry because Story of the Stone had long become popular in Jingdo and had harmed many young ladies of large families. Among these young ladies, the most famous was the young lady of the Jingdo magistrate's family. Because she had read Dream of the Red Chamber, she had lost her appetite and was in a daze. In the end, the madam of the magistrate's family burned the manuscript. The young lady cried out in pain. "Burned my Baoyu." She became seriously ill and lingered on the bed for a long time. This matter had been sung about for a long time in Jingdo. Back then, it had been a bright spot in Fan Xian's unparalleled reputation. Fan Xian looked at the young lady of the Sun family sitting on the chair with her head lowered shyly. He couldn't resist sighing and shaking his head. He thought to himself, no wonder this young lady had been so excited after learning of his identity and decorated her room like this. She was his #1 fan in the world. No, it should be said that she was a girl with the Dream of the Red Chamber syndrome, a pitiful person who had been enchanted by Baoyu. He gazed at the young lady of the Sun family and gently said, "Didn't you burn the manuscript?" Sun Pin raised her head shyly and glanced at the red-covered copy of the Story of the Stone on the desk. In a mosquito-like voice, she said, "Later, I bought a copy and got better." The Jingdo magistrate. Sir Sun is now the Jingdo magistrate. "It is difficult for me to make the connection," Fan Xian said with a slight smile. In his heart, he thought that although the magistrate was only 2 ranks below the magistrate, the difference in power was like heaven and earth, particularly in such an important place as the Jingdo government. It was difficult for a typical magistrate to climb to the position of magistrate. Furthermore, it had only been 3 years. Sun Pin glanced at him and quietly said, "I still have to thank Sir Fan Jr. for this." "Thank me?" "Yes." After talking for a while, only then did Fan Xian understand that ever since he entered the capital, countless things had happened. Back then, the Jingdo magistrate, Mei Zhili, had been forced to leave the capital because of Fan Xian's lawsuit with the son of the Minister of Rights, Guoyu. Now, it was said that he had a carefree position in Yanjing. The Jingdo magistrate who had taken over had been involved in a murder to silence witnesses because of the power struggle between Fan Xian and the second prince and had been investigated. In less than 3 years, the Jingdo magistrate had changed a number of times. It was because of this that Sun Jingxiu was able to climb from magistrate to the position of Jingdo magistrate. Thus, it was not wrong for Lady Sun to say that all of this was because of Fan Xian. Fan Xian looked calmly at the young lady of the Sun family. His mind spun quickly. The Jingdo government's position was very special. He had suddenly and coincidentally met this young lady. Was the heavens helping him in some way? "Lady Sun, do you trust me?" Fan Xian looked at Sun Pin with an incomparably pure and sincere gaze. You can call me Pin Sun Pin said with her head lowered. Pin Fan Xian's heart jumped. He knew that he had a bit more confidence in this matter. Warmly, he said, right now, I am the courts, I don't believe you. Sun Pin raised her head in panic and spoke first. I'm a bad, you're not. Sun Pin bit her lip and looked at Fan Xian's face, which was very close to her. She didn't know that this was the effect of Fan Xian's disguise. She only felt that the dream she had for 3 years seemed to have become reality in an instant. The man in her dream had come to her like this. She could see him, hear his voice, and even smell the sweat on his palm earlier. A wave of panic and joy bloomed in her heart. In Sun Pin's heart, how could Sir Fan Jr. be a bad person who plotted to assassinate the emperor? She had never thought of it like this. Having spoken to this point, there was nothing to worry about. Fan Xian looked at her warmly and said each word gently and shamelessly, Pin, there is something I need your help with. Sun Pin bit her lower lip and nodded forcefully. She then said in a small voice, quickly, light the lamp. No one knew whether she thought the moonlight outside was too dark and she couldn't see the face of her dream idol clearly or whether she was reminding Fan Xian to not arouse the suspicions of the servants in the Sun Manor. Everyone under heaven is looking for you, but no one would have thought you would be hiding in Sir Sun's manor in the Jingdo government. Sir, you and I have known each other for 2 years. It is only now that I truly admire you. Under the candlelight, a young man sat opposite Fan Xian and shook his head. Fan Xian gazed at him with a slight smile and said, Sir Yan Jr., have you finally learned to admire others? The person who had come was the first person Fan Xian had contacted after entering the capital, Yan Bingyun. After Fan Xian returned to the capital, he had not had a proper place to stay, so this was the first time the two of them had met. As for how Yan Bingyun had shaken off the surveillance of the internal court and quietly come to the Sun Manor where he would not draw attention, that was not a problem Fan Xian needed to worry about. As the only candidate to become the next commissioner of the Overwatch Council, it was unlikely that he did not even have this bit of ability. Yan Bingyun looked at him and said, It is not only me who admires you. I'm afraid the eldest princess also admires you. Sir Sun of the Jingdo government has an edict to capture you, yet you are hiding in his daughter's boudoir. Fan Xian spread his hands and shrugged. My luck has always been better than other people's. After a slight pause, he said in a more serious tone, Perhaps this is not luck. After all, this is a benefit that my past has brought me. Yan Bingyun moved closer to the chair and crossed his hands in front of his legs. Rubbing them together, he glanced at the large bed in the back of the boudoir and furrowed his brows. With important matters at hand, let's not bother with trifles. However, how are you going to use this girl? His voice was very low. He was not worried that the young lady of the Sun family would hear. Fan Xian calmly said, I need a central point of communication. If there was no Sun Manor, it would be impossible for me to speak to you so calmly. It would also be difficult for the orders I want to pass on to be successfully passed on. The Sun Manor is where the Jingdo matter started. Yan Bingyun looked at him and shook his head a moment later. He sighed and said, Only you could do such a thing. That's right, no one would suspect that you would hide in the Jingdo government. Lady Sun is willing to help me, Fan Xian calmly said. The city gates are basically half open to me. I don't think a young lady can have that much influence over her father. This is a problem I need to consider. What you need to do is to arrange it. Fan Xian stared into Yan Bingyun's eyes. You need to arrange for the people entering the capital to be evenly distributed outside the manors. Once you act, you need to strike like lightning and not give them any chance to retaliate. Yan Bingyun paused and then said, But, there is a problem right now. A month ago, all of my authority in the council was taken by Director Chen. Fan Xian's pupils constricted slightly. In a low voice, he said, "What is this? Has Chen Pingping gone mad?" Yan Bingyun fell silent and said, "We'll talk about this later. I only care about one thing." He stared into Fan Xian's eyes and said each word clearly, "Is the emperor dead or not?" After a deathly silence, Fan Xian slowly opened his mouth and said, "In the entire Great Dong Mountain, only I escaped. Although I didn't personally see it, I'm guessing the odds are against me. Otherwise, the eldest princess wouldn't be so confident." What exactly happened on Dong Mountain? Fan Xian didn't have much time to go into the details. He only said, Ku He, Sigujian, and Yi Luyun should have all arrived. Hearing this, Yan Bingyun's face became ashen. He knew that the emperor would never be able to return to Jingdo. He gradually clenched his fists tightly and asked, "Where are your 500 black knights?" "They are hidden outside the capital. I have a way to contact them, but it would be difficult to quietly transport them into the capital. Presently, you have the Jingdo government's cover. You should have a way to transport these people in." Yan Bingyun's words made clear Fan Xian's plans. Correct. The 500 black knights outside the capital are no match for the Jingdo garrison. If they let loose and went on a killing spree in the capital, with the help of the great prince's imperial army, I think they would have a terrifying effect. There are still 1,400 people in the council in Jingdo, Fan Xian said. This is the power you and I can control. We must move it in Jingdo before the eldest princess controls the 13 city gate guards. There is something I must remind you of. Yan Bingyun was silent for a moment. He then suddenly said in a hoarse voice, "If my predictions are correct, regarding the assassination of the emperor, Director Chen should have known about it beforehand and even secretly cooperated with the eldest princess's actions." Fan Xian's pupils constricted. He couldn't speak for a long time. The strange situation in the Overwatch Council fell into his eyes, but he still could not believe that Chen Pingping would play such a role in this matter. "Probably not," he said with his head lowered. "The Qin family's army has already surrounded Qin Garden. This is the truth." A cold light flashed through Yan Bingyun's eyes as he stared at him. "I don't care what relationship you have with the director. Since you are going to carry out the posthumous edict on behalf of the emperor, you must pay attention to this matter. I don't want you to be killed before you even do anything." Fan Xian said, "Relax, I always have faith in human nature. The director will not harm me." He took out the commissioner token and solemnly handed it to Yan Bingyun. "I don't know how many people this token can move in the council, but your authority has been taken away. If you want to stop this matter, it's best if you use this token to try." Yan Bingyun accepted the token without a word and unconsciously glanced at the figure of the young lady in the inner room. He shook his head and said, "It will definitely be useful. I am also beginning to believe in such things as luck now." Fan Xian smiled and said, "I once heard a saying that men conquer the world, and women conquer the world by conquering men." Chapter 549. Before Yan Bingyun left, he was stopped by Fan Xian. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then asked in a low voice, "Is there any news of Hong Chongqing and the Qinian unit?" After escaping from Dong Mountain, Fan Xian had charged straight toward Danzhou. The trusted aides on the white sailboat had all been scattered in that chase. Although Yan Xiaoyi had died to Fan Xian's assault rifle, Fan Xian had been worried about the lives of Qinghua and his trusted subordinates. Since the rebel army had the power to seal off Dong Mountain and the provinces had given their reward as the eldest princess had wished, they had a way to seal off the road back to the capital. Yan Bingyun's thin lips pressed together tightly. A moment later, he said, "No news." He glanced at Fan Xian, indicating that he had already left council affairs for a month and did not know enough about this area of intelligence. Fan Xian shook his head. "Don't comfort me. No news is bad news. All right, I admit that I still have channels to know about the council's intelligence. Yan Bingyun looked at him and said, there is a very strange matter. The intelligence system on Dongshan Road, and I'm not just talking about the councils, but all of the intelligence feedback systems, seems to have stopped working. The most recent news came 3 days ago. Hearing this news, Fan Xian's heart tightened. Sweat gradually seeped out of his palms. His mouth was dry, but he forced his expression to remain calm. Forcing a smile, he said, for now, we can't worry about other places. Let's first settle the Jingdo matter. Yan Bingyun brushed away the dust on his light robe and lowered his head. You've given me the token, which is the same as giving me the authority to command over 1,000 people. Do you want to give me a strategy? Fan Xian lowered his head and was silent for a moment. He then said, follow the established plan. Yan Bingyun glanced at him and furrowed his brows. A lot of people will die. I don't want to die myself. Fan Xian glanced back at him with a cold expression. I want you to control the 13 city gate guards. This is the crux of the problem. Yan Bingyun did not show his loyalty. He only shook his head straightforwardly and said, the Overwatch Council alone cannot control the 13 city gate guards. The Empress Dowager controls the city gate guards. She will not allow the Qin and Yi family's armies to enter the capital, Fan Xian said as he looked at Yan Bingyun. Fan Xian looked at Yan Bingyun and said, he doesn't want Jingdo to sink into the flames of war. What we need to do is help the palace control it. The 13 city gate guards were actually just a yamen that controlled the 9 city gates inside and outside Jingdo. If the eldest princess's side had continued to infiltrate the 13 city gate guards, they would have already taken control of the city gate guards from the Empress Dowager's hands. Yan Bingyun shook his head. Betting one life on one door. This is a very foolish plan. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and said, there's nothing I can do. I only have the Imperial Army at hand, which I can't fully rely on. I don't dare to clash head-on with the Qin and Yi families in Jingdo. Everyone says that Yi Zhong has returned to Dingzhou, but who would believe that? What if the 13 city gate guards can't hold the fort? Yan Bingyun said with slight mockery, as for cultivating trusted aides in the court, you and I are no match for those of the older generation. The eldest princess must have people in the city gate guards. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. Standing up, he patted Yan Bingyun's shoulder. Even if we can't stop the Qin family's army from entering the capital, at least you can find out when the Qin family will arrive, how many people will arrive, and how they will arrive. Yan Bingyun's shoulder felt cold. He looked at Fan Xian with a slightly shocked gaze. Fan Xian gazed at him calmly. You said before that the older generation loves to play this kind of betrayal and death trap. I know there are people under the old cripple who are preparing to kill the old Qin family's death trap. Yan Bingyun smiled bitterly. If I guessed correctly, your father is the chess piece the director has buried on the old Qin master's side for decades, Fan Xian said with a slight smile. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, thus, whatever the Qin family's army wants to do will be within our grasp. It should be possible to fight for a perfect time difference. Yan Bingyun sighed, bowed, and silently left the Sun Manor. After Yan Bingyun left, Fan Xian sat in Sun Pin's boudoir and began to count his fingers. He wasn't calculating how much silver he had earned after his rebirth. Rather, he was calculating time, calculating the power he could control in his hands, and what kind of ripples he could create in Jingdo. After thinking it over and over again, he had to admit that if the Qin and Yi family's army entered the capital, he could only fight guerrilla warfare. Thus, before the army entered the capital, he had to launch a thunderous attack on the powers in the royal palace. Lady Ning, Yi Gui-pin, and the third prince, whose state of mind was unknown, were the people he had to save. As long as he could save these people, he was not afraid of anything. Holding a sniper rifle and fighting guerrilla warfare, Fan Xian could not imagine who could do anything to him. However, he still felt a bit sullen. At least, he was unable to have a head-on confrontation with the eldest princess's side on the battlefield. He had no choice but to choose to strike and retreat. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but shake his head. He wondered if the emperor knew that the Qin kingdom had fallen to such a state, would he regret forbidding him from having any contact with the military? There were 7 roads of elite soldiers under heaven. None of them could be used by him. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and was speechless. However, Fan Xian was still full of confidence. He stood up and walked to the window. Glancing at the gradually extinguishing lights outside, his expression was calm. He began to have some optimistic judgments about this matter. His confidence in some of the elders also grew. Sir Fan Jr. Seeing Yan Bingyun leave, the young lady of the Sun family, who had been sitting quietly in her room, walked out slowly. She was no longer as excited and terrified as she was earlier. She had recovered the pride and restraint that a lady of a noble family should have. It was only the occasional glance she gave Fan Xian that revealed the complicated emotions in her heart. "You can call me Ng." Fan Xian returned the bow warmly. Sun Pin's heart was filled with emotion. She also faintly guessed what Sir Fan Jr. had been discussing with the famous Sir Yen Jr. earlier. She couldn't help but feel afraid. She also felt excited because she could help Sir Fan Jr. She lowered her head and quietly said, "Sir Fan Jr., I am only a girl. I don't know exactly what has happened in court, but She raised her face and looked bravely at Fan Xian. "But, I trust you. So, if you need me to do anything, please speak frankly." Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then smiled and said, "Traitors are currently in power in the court. The ruler is not a ruler, the officials are not officials, the sons are not sons, and the country is not a country. Even if I have to give up this body of flesh and blood, I will try to pull down those traitors and evil sons from the dragon chair in the palace. If you are willing to help me, you don't need to do much. You just need to let me stay here for a few days." Sun Pin was slightly surprised. She hadn't expected Sir Fan Jr. to ask for so little. She was faintly disappointed. Pressing her lips together, she summoned up her courage and said, "Sir, my father should be able to help you." Fan Xian smiled and didn't explain anything. Right now, having the Sun Manor as a middle ground had already helped him greatly. At least, from now on, he could easily contact his subordinates in Jingdo through Yan Bingyun. The beginning of the entire plan would begin in this young lady's boudoir. "If there is a chance, I will indeed need you to introduce me to your father. There are many things that I will need Sir Sun's help with." Fan Xian did not completely believe that a girl could persuade the Jingdo magistrate to change his stance. However, with Sun Pin acting as a bridge, as long as the opportunity changed and Fan Xian's side held the advantage, Sir Sun might be able to add some flourishing flowers, and Fan Xian would not refuse. The shame on Sun Pin's face grew stronger. A moment later, she bit her lower lip and said, "Actually, Pin is truly unfilial. Sir Fan Jr., please be more tolerant of my father." Sir Sun had followed the Empress Dowager's edict to capture Fan Xian, but Sun Pin had hidden him in her boudoir. Once Fan Xian truly turned the tables, who knew how he would deal with the people who had once harmed him? Sun Pin knew just how bloody the battle for royal power was. Her impulsive actions would probably harm her father greatly in the future, which was why she said she was unfilial. Fan Xian sighed and looked tenderly at this weak girl. Involuntarily, a slight sense of guilt welled up in his heart. Comfortingly, he said, "Don't worry, if the court's righteousness is restored, Ng promises that at least your father's life will not be in danger. If he is willing to suddenly repent, then he will be a meritorious official." Having received his promise, Sun Pin happily wiped away her new tears. She had not thought about whether or not the promise of a political figure would count. She bowed deeply toward Fan Xian. "Thank you, Sir Fan Jr. I should be the one thanking you." Fan Xian bowed deeply and solemnly toward Sun Pin Er. Gently, he said, "Although I cannot be considered a good person, I am not someone who likes to kill. I also hope that the Empress Dowager can see the truth of the Jingdo matter and resolve everything peacefully without the need for bloodshed." The two of them bowed toward each other. It looked like they were bowing to heaven and earth. Fan Xian felt it was inappropriate and hesitantly rose. Fan Xian turned and looked at the lonely sky and moon outside the window. He thought self-mockingly, how could such a quiet night be a day for killing? There were some mysterious shadows moving back and forth outside Prince Heching's manor. The guards responsible for protecting the manor didn't even glance at them because they knew they were spies from the internal court. Perhaps there were also some spies from the Bureau of Military Affairs. However, everyone knew each other's existence, so no one would take the initiative to provoke anything. The prince controlled the imperial army in his hands. As long as his military power was not reduced, the various powers in Jingdo would have to maintain supreme respect and curry favor with this manor. Ever since the news of the emperor's assassination spread, the Empress Dowager closed the palace doors and strictly suppressed the restless movements of all sides. Prince Heching's manor had become the focus of the various powers in Jingdo. The eldest prince's protection of the princess consort's family and servants in the residence was so strict that it left one dumbfounded. After all, he had once been the commander-in-chief of the Western expedition. At this critical juncture, he had completely displayed his fierceness. He had actually mobilized a group of 500 imperial soldiers to surround the prince's manor. In this way, even if something were to happen in the palace, the great prince's trusted aides would be able to maintain the safety of the prince's manor until the very last moment. As for whether or not this was in line with tradition and against Qing law, no one dared to say anything. Most of the soldiers in Jingdo were in the great prince's hands. If he wanted to do this, no one could do it without the Empress Dowager's tacit approval. As for those civil officials who had enough courage to speak, they had all been captured and thrown into prison in Taiji Palace today. Presently, the Qing kingdom had no ruler. Whoever had the most soldiers had the loudest voice. The second housekeeper of Prince Heching's manor walked out from the side of the main door. Lowering his voice, he said something to the guards as if to express his condolences. Immediately after, a person walked out from among the guards and went to the back of the manor to arrange for a carriage. Amidst the clattering of hooves, a carriage painted with the manor's insignia drove out of the darkness and stopped in front of the manor's stone steps. The imperial soldiers guarding around the manor moved their gazes over but did not have any reaction. Jingdo enforced a strict curfew. Other than the powers chasing after Fan Xian in various workshops, there was basically no one on the streets. Logically speaking, no one was allowed to go out in the middle of the night. However, the person who was about to get into the carriage was the second housekeeper of the great prince's manor. The imperial soldiers pretended not to see him. The second steward warmly greeted the imperial army officer. Standing on the stone steps, he narrowed his eyes and looked into the darkness at the end of the street. He knew that in the darkness, there were countless people secretly watching his movements. However, he was not worried about anything. He was going to see the strategist in the eldest princess's residence and arrange the next steps for both sides. This second housekeeper was the head spy the Northern Qi Emperor had sent to Jingdo. He was the person who had secretly sold Fan Xian's movements in Yangtsong Alley to the eldest princess behind Wang Fei's back. The second housekeeper's brows gradually relaxed. He was under the emperor's orders, so he did not think much of Wang Fei's anger. There were many things that had to be done first and reported later. Although the great prince had sent the imperial soldiers here, he was forced to stay in the palace. It was impossible for him to know exactly what had happened in the manor. Fan Xian had been betrayed by someone in his manor. He smiled slightly and raised his foot to walk down the steps, preparing to climb into the carriage. His steady right hand slowly lifted the curtain of the carriage. The second housekeeper's pupils constricted nervously. There were a few black-clothed people looking coldly at him in the supposedly empty carriage. The second housekeeper felt a bone-piercing coldness follow the numerous holes in his body and invade his brain. After the coldness, there was a boundless pain. He opened his mouth wide, but he couldn't shout out a single word. He could only gasp with difficulty and lower his head. Finally, he saw clearly the 3 metal drills that had suddenly appeared on his body. The ice-cold metal drills pierced mercilessly into his body and skewered him like an innocent chick waiting to be slaughtered. Warm blood flowed out along the grooves on the metal drills. The Fifth Bureau. In the instant before his death, the second housekeeper finally recognized the identity of the assassins. He knew that they were his famous colleagues in the south and accepted his fate in despair. He had betrayed Fan Xian, so he should have known that he would face the Overwatch Council's endless attacks. However, he had not thought that in just a few hours, the Overwatch Council, which had been like a plate of loose sand, would once again have such a powerful ability to move. There was no time to think. The second housekeeper's hands grasped the metal drill in his chest weakly and fell off the carriage. With a thud, he fell to the ground. Fresh blood flowed everywhere. There was no sign of life. The first to discover the assassination in front of the manor door were, of course, the manor guards nearby. They were shocked by the bloody scene and didn't react for a moment. They could only watch as the second housekeeper, who had been trusted by Wang Fei, was viciously stabbed to death by 3 metal drills. He fell into a pool of blood and twitched endlessly. The carriage had already started moving in a very short time. It rolled over the second housekeeper's body and charged into the darkness. The spies watching this scene from the dark corners couldn't help but be dumbstruck. They had never thought that someone would be able to kill the housekeeper-like figure in front of the heavily guarded door of Prince Heching's manor. They didn't know how those people had hidden in the manor's own carriage without leaving a trace. Naturally, these spies would not rush forward to surround the assassins in the carriage. Instead, they opened their eyes excitedly and watched the show. They all guessed who had made the first move and what they should report to their masters when they returned in a moment. Kill. After the imperial soldiers stationed outside the manor paused for a moment, they reacted as quickly as possible. With an angry roar, they stabbed toward the carriage with the spears in their hands. With a number of clicks, the horses pulling the horses began to cry out sorrowfully before they fell to the ground. The lethality of the imperial army's encirclement was terrifying. The spears shot out in unison. The horses fell to the ground and sent up a cloud of dust. The carriage was also forced to a stop in the middle of the street. However, the encirclement had not been completed. There was an opening at the end of the street. With a crash, the carriage shattered into countless pieces. Immediately after, a large amount of thick smoke was blasted out of the carriage. The smoke contained poisonous gas. It forced the surrounding imperial soldiers back a little and made them cough repeatedly. The 3 Fifth Bureau assassins in the carriage became 3 black shadows. Using the cover of the poisonous smoke, they charged out of the opening and disappeared into the darkness of Jingdo before the imperial army could close in. They only left behind a sinister and cold announcement. This is the result of betraying Duke Fan. At the entrance of the manor, the poisonous smoke had dissipated. The housekeeper had died, and the imperial soldiers were being treated for poisoning. It was a sorrowful and tense scene. In everyone's hearts, the last words the assassin had left echoed. Other than the terrifying professional assassins of the Overwatch Council, who had the ability and courage to carry out an assassination at the front door of Prince Heching's manor? After the emperor passed, Director Chen was poisoned by a master from Dongyi, and Commissioner Fan became a wanted criminal of the court. In just one day, the Overwatch Council, which used to have a sinister and intimidating reputation, suddenly became a plate of loose sand. It completely lost its magic. This sinister and brave assassination and the announcement finally told all the powers in Jingdo that Sir Fan Jr. was still alive. The Overwatch Council was still here. Those who betrayed him and those who tried to kill him would slowly welcome the Overwatch Council's endless vengeance. How long would the murders and poison soak this city in the darkness last? How many people would die? The chaos, panic, and fear outside the manor did not completely spread into the manor. The heavily guarded manor appeared particularly calm. Wang Fei's face was cold as she sat in the slightly cool pavilion. Her eyes looked absent-mindedly out the window. Slowly, she said, "Is this a warning to me?" "No." Yan Bingyun slowly rose and calmly said, "This is the commissioner's sincerity and message." Wang Fei turned her head and looked solemnly into his eyes. Yan Bingyun was not moved. Calmly, he said, "Wang Fei is Wang Fei, no longer the great princess of northern Qi. No matter how many people like the second housekeeper die, presumably, you would not feel pain." Wang Fei's heart jumped. She knew what he said made sense. Since she had already married into the Qin kingdom, according to Fan Xian's reminder in Yangcong Alley, she was already a person of the Qin kingdom. If she continued to think about her brother in the north, it would probably not do her any good in the future. "The message the commissioner wants to send is very clear," Yan Bingyun said calmly. Yan Bingyun calmly said, "The people who died tonight will gradually prove this point. He has regained control of the Overwatch Council." Wang Fei was silent for a moment and then said, "I am very willing to work with Sir Fan Jr." She suddenly smiled slightly. "Of course, other than thanking Sir Fan Jr. for his determination to kill, I must also express my admiration. It was truly a good kill. There was no need for words. They both understood each other. Who knew how many people the shout outside the manor would confuse? Wang Fei suddenly opened her mouth and said solemnly, "But, assassination has never been the right way to solve problems. I hope Sir Yan will be careful." She knew that Fan Xian was still being pursued. The reason the Overwatch Council's power could be gathered and spread out such a sinister and cold power in such a short amount of time was all because of the ability of the official in front of her. Perhaps Fan Xian had set the policy of assassination to establish power, but the person carrying it out was the person in front of her. Yan Bingyun quietly said, "The people in the council have long dispersed. Our advantage is in the darkness." He bowed to Wang Fei and slowly said, using the commissioner's words, "We don't draw our swords, we only kill. As for the specific consequences and how the Empress Dowager will react, that is something the commissioner needs to consider." "How many people will die tonight?" Wang Fei asked worriedly. If Fan Xian truly raised a storm of blood in Jingdo, was he really not worried that the Empress Dowager would retaliate with bloody methods? What about the people in the palace? Chapter 550. The previous chapter misspelled the 5th and 6th bureau. Apologies here. Also, allow me to sigh sorrowfully. I am truly tired. In one night, many people died. The news was like the first frost in early autumn. It immediately deflated the spirits of the conspirators and followers who had come in high spirits. After the civil officials' battle to the death in Taiji Palace, the deaths that followed in the dark finally made these people understand that there was no such thing as a gentle end to a battle that involved the state. Furthermore, Sir Fan Jr. held the posthumous edict in his hand and had the Overwatch Council's black water under his feet. As long as such a person was not captured, no one could think of living their days of glory and wealth. The Empress Dowager and Crown Prince in the palace understood that this was the attitude Fan Xian, who was hidden in the darkness, was expressing to them. Faced with this attitude, the Empress Dowager and Crown Prince were unusually angry. This attitude was the same as Fan Xian standing in front of them and saying, "I have the power to kill anyone I want to kill." I am threatening you. This was a very immoral method of terrorism. It was threatening the Empress Dowager and Crown Prince to temporarily not act rashly, not touch the Fan family, and not touch the dozens of officials in the celestial prison. Otherwise, if they truly acted rashly, who could kill who? From a certain point of view, Fan Xian's method of intensifying the conflict was very likely a stupid choice. How could the people in the palace be threatened by an official? If the Empress Dowager truly wanted to play a game where both sides suffered and led troops into the capital, what could Fan Xian do? The Overwatch Council could only use its magic in the darkness. Once it encountered a truly powerful army, it could only retreat. For some reason, the Empress Dowager and Crown Prince temporarily chose to be silent and did not carry out their most powerful counterattack. In the following 2 days, the eldest princess's faction gathered together and continued to search the streets and alleys of Jingdo for traces of Fan Xian. Such a powerful force of action, in the end, they only destroyed a few of the Overwatch Council spies and killed 7 swordsmen of the 6th Bureau. They still did not capture Fan Xian. The Jingdo government and part of the garrison stationed in the city immediately surrounded the Yan Manor. After killing their way into the manor, they only captured a few servants in the manor and did not capture Yan Ruohai. They didn't even see the shadow of Lady Shen, much less Sir Yan Jr., who had helped Fan Xian secretly contact the old Overwatch Council members in Jingdo. The army had yet to enter the capital. The other side could only surround the square building by Tianhe Avenue from a distance and monitor it. They did not dare or have the ability to kill their way into the headquarters of the Overwatch Council. They were only ensuring that Fan Xian and Yan Bingyun had no way of entering the Overwatch Council. The surveillance of King Jing's manor was tightened, but no one dared to lead soldiers into the manor. Everyone was afraid of Fan Xian's eyes hiding in the dark. In just one night, most of the secret agents of the Overwatch Council received secret orders from above and did not return to the Yamen to do their work. They disappeared into the sea of people in Jingdo, hiding their power and protecting their own safety. They returned to the darkness they were most used to. A total of 600 people disappeared just like that. The disappearance of these Overwatch Council officials was the most direct threat to the nobles in the royal palace. There was suddenly no follow-up news from the rumored Crown Prince's ascension ceremony. Although the palace kept a tight watch on the news, how could such a shocking matter continue to be hidden after arresting over 40 officials and throwing them into prison? Gradually, the people of Jingdo began to discover the truth of the matter and knew that a big mess had occurred in the royal palace. The people did not have the power to change history. At least, they did not have the courage right now. They could only be forced to calmly face all of this. They closed their shops, stocked up on enough fine food, and returned to their own homes. Crawling into their blankets, they pressed their palms together and prayed to the heavens to quickly resolve this matter. It didn't matter who became emperor, but there had to be someone to be emperor. The streets of Jingdo appeared unprecedentedly solemn and desolate. Even though there was only a curfew, not many people dared to go out during the day. Originally, according to the eldest princess plan, the Crown Prince, who should have become the new emperor of Qing Kingdom, had already felt waves of unease among the people. The cause of the chaos was only accumulating within Jingdo. Once it spread out of Jingdo and extended to the provinces, then Qing Kingdom would truly fall into chaos. Thus, he had to stabilize all of this in the shortest amount of time. In order to stabilize it, he had to find Fan Xian and kill him. The Crown Prince looked at the mountainous pile of memorials beside him and smiled bitterly. He couldn't speak for a moment. In just 3 days, the number of memorials that had been submitted by the various provinces and provinces of Qing Kingdom had already reached 1,700. Usually, these memorials were taken by a few scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. The important matters were given to the emperor to decide, and the small matters were distributed to various departments to deal with. However, the scholars were all in prison, and the officials of various departments had sunk into chaos. Everyone in Jingdo was in a state of panic. The court was gradually unable to move, and government affairs were already in chaos. Taking down the memorials at the top of the small mountain, the crown prince glanced at them. His eyes gradually became confused. These memorials had arrived the latest. Other than Dongshan Road, the other 6 governors had sent the news of the emperor's assassination. Although these governors spoke respectfully, the sordid intent hidden between the lines was very clear. The crown prince sighed and thought helplessly, when did the civil officials of Qing Kingdom become so courageous? He suddenly thought of the dozens of officials in the celestial prison, led by the scholars Hu and Shu, who had endured 2 days and 3 nights in prison, yet not one of them had relented. The palace could not wait any longer. Since yesterday, they had used torture. However, they still had not worn down the officials' bones. He had even heard that starting at noon, Shu the scholar had taken the lead in a hunger strike. The crown prince rubbed his temples and felt a headache coming on. Did he really have to follow his aunt's intentions and kill all these officials? But, what if he killed them all? Who would handle court affairs? Did he really want to be a loner? Eunuch Ho suddenly walked into the royal study with a face full of panic without being sent in. The crown prince raised his head and glanced at him. He narrowed his eyes slightly. He knew that Eunuch Ho was his aunt's trusted aide and a trustworthy person. Eunuch Ho moved closer to his ear and said a few words. His face was slightly pale. The crown prince suddenly jumped and slammed his palm on the desk, sending the memorials to the ground. Gritting his teeth, he said darkly, "The 3rd prince has been assassinated. Who gave you the guts to do so?" Eunuch Ho's body shook. He hurriedly lowered his body and said sorrowfully, "It has nothing to do with me. It has nothing to do with me. Unrelated." The crown prince stared coldly into his eyes. "Right now, you are in charge of the palace. Without your hand, how could an assassin have run to the Qin corridor? It really has nothing to do with this servant." Eunuch Ho quickly begged for mercy and said in a low voice. The crown prince only calmed his angry emotions a moment later. With a wave of his sleeve, he walked toward the back of the palace. Yes, he wanted to be the emperor. He wanted to kill Fan Xian. He knew that his 3rd brother was Fan Xian's student and the greatest enemy of his throne, but he still had not thought of killing the 3rd prince. In his eyes, the 3rd prince was still a child. If something really did happen to the 3rd prince, who knew how crazy the already chaotic royal palace and Jingdo would become? As he walked towards the back of the palace, the crown prince's face was ashen as he thought to himself, who was it that wanted to kill my 3rd brother? Was his aunt using his 3rd son's death to force him to be even more ruthless? Did 2nd brother use 3rd brother's death to intensify the conflict between him and the world? However, he knew that no matter what, old 3rd couldn't die. The crown prince prayed in his heart. Li Qingping was the 3rd prince. His life and death had a great effect, so he had to be careful. However, the officials in Jingdo did not have such good treatment. Putting aside the important officials who were currently locked up in the celestial prison by the internal court and suffering torture, some of the officials who still persisted in working in the 6 ministries were also living wretched lives. There were no officials in the Hall of Governmental Affairs working, but the officials of the 6 ministries were still working hard to maintain the operation of the country. Although the memorials the crown prince temporarily approved in the palace had not gone through the royal seal, most of the officials tacitly acknowledged the crown prince's authority. The Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, was hiding in King Jing's manor. The Minister of Appointments, Yan Hangshu, was busy arranging new officials into the various ministries to lay the foundation for the crown prince's ascension. The other 4 ministries were handling official affairs in a state of panic. As for the officials whose positions were not stable or who had innate problems, they had already been ostracized. The people who had the deepest connections to Fan Xian's faction had been cleanly stripped of their official positions and detained in a prison to await trial. The celestial prison could no longer hold them. It had been filled by the loyal followers Fan Xian's father-in-law had left behind. Minister Fan's connections in court were rather secretive and had not been completely dug out by the eldest princess. Fan Xian himself did not have much help in court. Logically speaking, it should not be a big problem. Even the 4 disciples of Fan Xian's that everyone knew, Ho Jichang still shouldered a dangerous life and was watching the movements of the navy in Jiaozhou. He secretly communicated with Su Maokai and was ready to act at any moment. Cheng Jialin had been arranged by Fan Xian in Suzhou to control the palace treasury with Su Wenmao. Yang Wanli had already been building the dikes in the south for a year. Shi Chanli should be in the Song Kingdom, continuing his journey as the greatest pimp in the world. Even if the eldest princess wanted to act against Fan Xian's 4 students, with the current situation in Jingdou unsettled, the crown prince unable to ascend to the throne, and the attitudes of the governors of the 6 roads unclear, she could not extend her hand that far. Unfortunately, it was the beginning of autumn, just after the summer floods. After the water transport governor's yamen finished building the dikes, as usual, they had to send someone back to the capital to ask for silver. This year, the person sent back to the capital to ask for silver was none other than Yang Wanli. He had been placed by Fan Xian into the clear water department of officials. He had done his best in the matter of repairing the dikes and had been praised by everyone in the water transport yamen. Additionally, they knew of his family connection to the Minister of Revenue, so they naturally sent him back to the capital. They had thought it would be an easy matter for Yang Wanli to return to the capital and ask for silver from the court. Unexpectedly, the emperor had been assassinated and Yang Wanli's teacher, Fan Xian, had been accused of plotting to assassinate the emperor. Thus, the moment Yang Wanli entered the Ministry of Works, he asked for himself. He had already been locked up in a dark room in a side alley for 2 days. During these 2 days, he had been tortured countless times. His body was covered in wounds. However, the people from the Ministry of Justice were unable to pry open his mouth and obtain a confession regarding Fan Xian. Of course, Yang Wanli was innocent. He did not believe that his teacher would do such an evil thing that angered both man and God. Furthermore, he had no way of knowing where Fan Xian was. At dusk, the internal court sent someone to detain him. Although his rank was far from enough to enjoy the celestial prison, the Empress Dowager gave him this honor on account of his teacher-student relationship with Fan Xian. Yang Wanli narrowed his blurry eyes and held his waist like an old farmer as he walked out of the dark room. He felt that there was not a place on his body that did not hurt. The bloody scabs on his fingers had healed and broken and were beginning to seep blood again. His heart was filled with despair. He knew that once he was taken into the celestial prison, it would probably be difficult for him to see the light of day again. 2 internal court guards held him and cursed as they walked outside. Along the way, the officials from the Ministry of Works saw this wretched sight but did not dare to look. They only turned their heads and pretended not to see. The officials all knew what had happened in Taiji Palace 2 days ago, so they were not at all surprised by the palace's bloody and ruthless punishment. If the crown prince wanted to ascend to the throne, he had to have these officials lower their heads and submit. Until the last step, the crown prince was unwilling to kill all of the officials. However, in 2 more days, the crown prince could not wait any longer. Walking out of the Ministry of Works yamen and onto the prison carriage, they passed a corner of the street. The prison carriage suddenly stopped. A guard furrowed his brows and stretched his head out to look. His head had just poked out the curtain of the carriage when it fell down with a thud. His entire head fell down. Looking at the headless body in front of him and the fresh blood gushing out of the cavity, Yang Wanli's face suddenly paled. His empty stomach was uncomfortable. Acid rose up and made him want to vomit. The other guard beside him was shocked and wanted to call for help, but a metal rod pierced into the outside of the carriage sealed his voice. The curtain of the carriage was lifted, revealing Fan Xian's always calm and handsome face. Fan Xian looked at the still shaken Yang Wanli and smiled. Do you want to come out? Yang Wanli's tears flowed freely. He looked at his teacher and nodded repeatedly. In a trembling voice, he said, Teacher, it is too risky. Wanli is not worth it. Fan Xian didn't have the patience to listen anymore. He pulled him down and climbed into the Overwatch Council's special carriage. In a moment, they had disappeared into the quiet streets of Jingdo and arrived at a secret meeting point. Recuperate. I didn't come to save you. I was just passing by. Fan Xian looked at the heavily injured Yang Wanli and sighed. Of course, if you actually died, would probably feel sad for a while. Fan Xian was not being pretentious. He was indeed passing by the Ministry of Works Yamen. His destination was even further. That was why he had come to this secret meeting point. Looking at Yan Bingyun in front of him, he asked, Has it all been confirmed? The eldest princess, Empress Dowager, Crown Prince, and Lady Shu are all in the palace. Yan Bingyun looked at him and said. All confirmed. As long as the royal palace is under control, everything will be settled. Does the Empress Dowager really trust the great prince that much? Fan Xian furrowed his brows. If I were her, I would have long swapped the great prince with someone from the old Qin family. Perhaps the Empress Dowager thinks that no one can save Lady Ning under the combined watch of the internal court eunuchs and guards. I can, Fan Xian said with a slight smile. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, Tonight, I will rescue all of my relatives and lock up the others. Yan Bingyun smiled, but his smile was a bit bitter. Fan Xian saw the unnaturalness in his expression and furrowed his brows. What happened in the palace? Or did something happen on Sir Yan's side? Don't worry about father. He's probably in the Qin family right now, Yan Bingyun said with his head lowered. There is something I should tell you before you enter the palace. Fan Xian looked at him. The third prince has been attacked by an assassin. Yan Bingyun raised his head to look at him. You didn't give me your channels in the palace, so I have no way of investigating the results of this assassination. However, I urge you to think of the worst. After all, he is only a child. Yi Guipin doesn't have much power to protect him. You're saying that Qingping was attacked by an assassin? Fan Xian's eyes narrowed. He didn't speak for a long time. However, he gradually tightened his fist. His knuckles turned white and green, revealing the true feelings in his heart. A moment later, he said in a heavy voice, It wasn't the crown prince. Yan Bingyun glanced at him and was slightly surprised. He didn't understand why he was so sure that the mastermind of the assassination in the palace this time was not the crown prince. Blood has already been seen. Fan Xian raised his head to look at him. The original plan to enter the palace tonight doesn't need to be brought forward. Follow the original plan. With the help of the Jingdo government, the Black Knights have scattered into the capital. There are 400 people in total. Yan Bingyun knew Fan Xian's current mood, so he didn't misunderstand his particularly cold expression. Instead, he calmly said, Since you've already decided to give up on the city gate department, then tonight's operation in the royal palace must be completed in one fell swoop. Not a single one can be missed. Of the 9 city gates, which one can I control? Fan Xian forced a smile. I don't have enough soldiers at hand, so I can't face them head-on. I can only take risks. Of course, I trust that neither the Empress Dowager or the eldest princess would think that I would dare to force my way into the palace. He stood and smiled slightly. People who are used to the schemes of emperors often forget such a thing as courage. A drunkard may not have a clear mind, but when holding a kitchen knife, it is still very powerful. Everyone says my mother-in-law is crazy. I want to know if my forceful attack without any sense of beauty will make her so angry she'll curse. This isn't a forceful attack, Yan Bingyun said. At least, the imperial army won't stop you. However, we only have 400 people. The other people of the 7th Bureau must set up a diversion outside the palace. The royal palace is so big, and we don't have enough people. If we want to guarantee that everyone will be captured, we must know exactly where the targets are. He looked at Fan Xian and said with slight worry, charging straight into the camp is a great taboo in the art of war. The meaning of gambling is too heavy. I don't know where your confidence comes from. I have people in the enemy camp, Fan Xian said with a slight smile. He then touched his smooth cheek. After learning of the third prince's assassination attempt, he hadn't said a word to Yan Bingyun about the matter. He only calmly arranged for the night's attack. In the end, Fan Xian couldn't resist slowly lowering his head. A wave of sadness rose in his chest. He silently prayed that nothing would happen to Qingping. You can't die. Fan Xian seemed to be saying this to himself and also to the third prince, whose life and death he didn't know. You are going to be the emperor in the future. Let us bring forward the time by 2 hours to see a palace murder that could change history and many people. After the assassination attempt on the Qing emperor on Dong Mountain, this was the second major event that shook the palace. The target of this assassination attempt was the third prince. The third prince was Li Qingping. His mother was Yi Guipin from Duke Lu's family. He had once followed the Duke of Danbua, Fan Xian, to study in Jiangnan for a year. Furthermore, he was the successor to the throne that Fan Xian had openly supported this year. Until a long time later, no one knew the main culprit in this murder attempt. No matter how one looked at it, the third prince could not be considered an important target. Although everyone knew that this 10-year-old boy had a great influence on the crown prince's right of succession, this influence was mainly because of Fan Xian's support. The third prince himself did not have any extraordinary magic or powerful power. Even if the crown prince was worried that his little brother would cause trouble, he would only think of killing Fan Xian and not the third prince. The third prince's death would not benefit the crown prince at all. Other than making the opposition of the court officials a little fiercer and making Fan Xian's rebellion a little crazier. Most importantly, with Fan Xian as the scapegoat, the Dong Mountain matter could forever be hidden behind the truth. If Li Qingping died in the royal palace, how would the present master of the royal palace, the crown prince, convince this little girl in history? The crown prince was like his father. They were both people who cared deeply about their reputation in history. Thus, he would waver between killing or not killing officials. Thus, he would not order his subordinates to kill the third prince. This was also why Fan Xian determined that the main culprit was not him. Then, who wanted to kill Li Qingping? In the Qin corridor of the royal palace, the young Li Qingping's face was full of shock. He ran wildly as he also thought of this question. Unfortunately, this was not Hongguang Palace. The Empress Dowager had no way to protect his life. He called for help, but the Qin corridor was too quiet. No one heard his cry for help. Li Qingping felt hopeless. He thought that if he had stayed obediently in Hongguang Palace, he would certainly not have died. He shouldn't have fallen for the trick earlier and run to the Qin corridor. However, the other party had said that his teacher had something to tell him and had shown him a keepsake. Thus, he had fallen for the trick and secretly hid it from his mother and the eunuchs and serving girls in Hongguang Palace to come to the Qin corridor alone. Run as fast as you can, child. How could a child outrun an adult? Panting, Li Qingping fell to the ground. Looking at the two eunuchs closing in on him step by step, his face was deathly pale. He gritted his teeth forcefully. These two eunuchs were not martial artists, but it was clear that they had received some kind of training to kill. Against a child without the strength to truss a chicken, it was too easy. It was so easy that the two eunuchs already treated Li Qingping as a dead person. One foot stepped on him to the ground and one hand reached into their clothes to take out a knife. Chapter 551. The next update will be on the 20th or 21st. I am truly sorry because I am about to embark on my journey home, and the journey will take 3 days and 2 nights. Our great motherland is truly too big, vast. Sometimes, it is truly a kind of torture. With a ding, the knife in the eunuch's hand brushed past the third prince's small body and stabbed ruthlessly into the stone floor below the Chen corridor. It actually sent up a few pieces of stone. It was clear how powerful the force was. The third prince twisted his body and screamed wildly. His feet kicked blindly and just happened to dodge the knife. The dagger in his trembling hand waved wildly a few times. With 2 slashing sounds, the lower robes of the 2 eunuchs were cut open, revealing 2 holes. The eunuchs' faces were cold. It seemed that they had not thought that a noble prince would carry a dagger at all times and that this dagger would be so sharp. The dagger he pulled out of his boot for the first time did not seem to be as effective as it should have been. Although the dagger was sharp, it was held in the hands of a 12-year-old boy. In this moment of life and death, Li Qingping learned the murderous courage Fan Xian had when he was 12, but he did not learn his teacher's ability to kill. Although the murderous eunuchs did not have any martial arts skills, their bodies were strong. How could he resist? One eunuch stepped firmly on Li Qingping to the ground. The other stepped on Li Qingping's elbow, making it impossible for him to move. Looking at the holes in his clothes, he shook his head. With one hand around Li Qingping's neck and the other holding the knife, he stabbed down again. Li Qingping's breathing became more and more difficult. He watched as the knife stabbed down. He knew he was going to die. He couldn't help but feel endless regret. He thought to himself that the knife he had just swung out hadn't even grazed the other person's side. In his despair, he couldn't help but give up. He closed his eyes and cried. He waited for a long time. Li Qingping could even feel the pain of a sharp object stabbing into his chest. The metal hand on his neck was cutting off his breathing. However, he found that he was still alive. The 2 feet on his body and hands did not seem to be stepping down with any more force. He opened his eyes in horror and saw a scene that terrified him. He saw that the 2 eunuchs above him were just like him. Their eyes were wide open in horror, and 2 streams of black blood flowed from the corners of their eyes. Li Qingping knew that his chance of survival had come again. Yelling wildly, he pulled his right hand out from under the eunuch's foot and ruthlessly stabbed the knife into the calf that was stepping on his chest. The dagger pierced his flesh and blood blossomed. Li Qingping struggled to his feet. He watched as the 2 eunuchs, who had been so fierce earlier, fell down like 2 pieces of wood. He couldn't help but feel a wave of fear. His legs were trembling, and he didn't dare to go forward to see what was going on. Why did the 2 imperial supervisory officers collapse with black blood flowing from the corners of their eyes? He lowered his head and looked at the knife in his chest. Only then did he feel the endless pain, and he cried out in pain. Fortunately, by the time the eunuch stabbed down, he had already breathed his last and could not continue to exert force. The tip of the knife had only sunk a third into his flesh. Only then did Li Qingping manage to save his life. Li Qingping dragged his limp legs and walked to the side of the 2 eunuchs who had already died. Other than fear, there was also endless doubt in his heart. He wondered if the heavens were helping him and casting a curse on these 2 eunuchs. It wasn't a curse. The third prince, who had woken up, finally understood. He stared in a daze at the 2 holes in the clothes of the 2 eunuchs. He then lowered his head to glance at the black dagger in his hand. The dagger in his hand was too sharp. Although he had only randomly swung it a few times earlier, it had not only cut through the eunuch's clothes, but it had also grazed the skin under their clothes. However, because the dagger was too sharp, or perhaps the teacher had smeared some medicine on the dagger, the 2 eunuchs did not feel anything. The dagger was imbued with the Overwatch Council's most powerful poison. Once the blade broke through the skin, the medicine entered the blood. It only took a moment for the two eunuchs to be poisoned to death. They didn't even have the time to kill. What a powerful poison! Li Qingping, who had narrowly escaped death, trembled all over. He held the dagger tightly in his hand and looked at the two eunuchs at his feet whose faces were gradually turning black. Finally, he could no longer stand and fell to the ground. He knew that if it wasn't for the fact that there was such a powerful poison on the dagger, if it wasn't for the fact that the two eunuchs had not thought of this, then no matter how he struggled, he would not have been able to escape death. His entire body trembled as he sat beside the two bodies. His face was deathly white. He didn't know what he should do next. This was the first time he had been killed. Even though he was a powerful prince who matured early, he was still shocked to the point that his state of mind was thrown into chaos. After sitting for an indeterminable amount of time, the 12-year-old Li Qingping finally came to his senses and climbed up with some difficulty. Looking at the two bodies beside him, a complicated emotion that a child should not have appeared in his eyes. This emotion was fear, helplessness, sadness, and a glimmer of excitement. It gradually turned into calmness and anger. Calm anger. Who wanted to kill him? Li Qingping didn't know, but he knew that it had to do with his brothers. He suddenly let out a cry. Then, he tightened his grip on the dagger by his hand and stabbed it down forcefully. 1 stab, 2 stab, 3 stab. He numbly and mechanically stabbed the dagger into the body of the eunuch beside him. Countless amounts of fresh blood sprayed out. In the end, the fresh blood splashed into black blood. He hated these people, so he wanted them to die completely. Of course, he would be very careful not to let the blood poison touch his body. After a while, he stopped crying out of fear. Holding onto the pillar in the corridor, he stood up. Looking at the quiet and empty long path in the Qin corridor, his lips trembled slightly. Then, he called out in a loud voice. At the end of the Qin corridor was the cold palace. There were always serving girls in the cold palace. Mother, I don't want you to live in the cold palace. The early autumn weather was not cold. In a side room at the back of Hongguang Palace, the third prince was tightly wrapped in a large blanket. Looking at Yi Guipin, who was looking at him with tears in her eyes, he lowered his voice and said in a firm and cold tone, I don't want to die. You can't die either. Yi Guipin's eyes were red. She held him tightly. Earlier, the cold palace had come to report. Only now did everyone know that the third prince had sneaked out of Hongguang Palace and had encountered assassins deep in the palace. In her anger, the Empress Dowager ordered the inner palace to strengthen its defenses. Not only did she capture the assassins, she also angrily reprimanded the eunuchs and serving girls in Hongguang Palace. Even Yi Guipin was not spared. Earlier, the Empress Dowager had stayed by the unconscious third prince's bedside for a while before leaving. After the Empress Dowager left, Li Qingping woke up and spoke to his mother in a trembling voice. It was clear that he had pretended to be unconscious in front of the Empress Dowager. This third prince only had a secret fear of the Empress Dowager and didn't want to face his grandmother. Don't worry. Yi Guipin held her son. Her shock had not yet faded. She said in a trembling voice, in Hongguang Palace, with the Empress Dowager watching, they won't dare to act rashly again. Li Qingping's expression darkened. He knew his mother was only comforting him, but he didn't say anything. Yi Guipin lowered her head to look at her son. She wanted to speak but stopped. In the end, she couldn't resist asking in a quiet voice, those two eunuchs, how did they die? Whose people did they belong to? I don't know. Li Qingping didn't explain the matter of the dagger. At the same time he had called for help, he had already hidden the dagger in the trees beside the Qin corridor. There was a glimmer of terror in his eyes. Looking at his mother, he said, suddenly dying. I don't know who wanted to kill me. Yi Guipin fell silent and glanced around. She found that there were too many people and too many eunuchs and serving girls waiting outside the side room. It was indeed not convenient to say too much, so she hesitantly closed her mouth. Ever since they learned of the emperor's assassination, she and the third prince had been under house arrest in Hanguang Palace. They didn't know what had happened outside. They only knew that Fan Xian had been made a criminal and that the Fan and Lu families were both under the control of the internal court. The Empress Dowager's gaze toward her grew colder and colder. Looking at this palace, Yi Guipin felt a bone-chilling coldness. She thought to herself, this Hanguang Palace doesn't seem to be very safe. A middle-aged woman walked in from outside the room. It was the great prince's birth mother, Ning the Talented. Yi Guipin quickly stood and bowed. The two mothers met each other's eyes and sighed endlessly. The crown prince had also come to visit and comforted his brother. He also promised that he would find out who the true killer was. These words were said with great sincerity, but Yi Guipin didn't hear them. It wasn't until night gradually fell, the people gradually left, and the room gradually became quiet that Yi Guipin looked at her son hidden under the blankets and faintly said, if it wasn't the crown prince, who could it be? The third prince had been stabbed to death. For the various powers in Jingdo, who would benefit the most? Yi Guipin involuntarily thought of a person's name but didn't dare say it. Li Qingping looked at his mother's thoughtful expression and felt a chill in his heart. He knew who his mother was suspecting. Resolutely, he shook his head and said, it wasn't my teacher. Yi Guipin was suspecting Fan Xian because there was a large group of civil officials standing firmly by Fan Xian's side. They were using the so-called posthumous edict and the name of righteousness to attack the crown prince. If the third prince had truly died in the royal palace, the crown prince would not be able to clear his name no matter what. In terms of public opinion, he would be at a disadvantage. Furthermore, if Fan Xian truly had the confidence to defeat the crown prince, then what was the point of keeping the third prince alive? Yi Guipin looked at her son and faintly said, although he is your teacher, he is, after all, not your real cousin. He is my real brother, the third prince bit his lip and said. Yi Guipin sighed. In this royal family, where is there such a thing as brotherhood, teacher, and disciple? Earlier, you didn't tell the Empress Dowager and Crown Prince that those two eunuchs used a keepsake to trick you into going to the Qin corridor. If they weren't your teacher's people, how could they have a keepsake? The keepsake was actually very simple. It was just a page from one of the third prince's favorite books in the Peng Manor by Westlake in Jiangnan. Li Qingping lowered his head. I won't suspect teacher. Furthermore, I believe in his abilities. If he really wanted to kill me and throw the palace into further chaos, he wouldn't use the keepsake. These are all places where it's easy to reveal flaws. As for Master, he would never reveal so many flaws. Yi Guipin forced a smile and didn't say anything more. Looking at her emotions and the current dangerous situation, she was willing to believe her son's judgment of Fan Xian. Other than Fan Xian, she and her son had no one else to rely on. Yes, but I don't know when Sir Fan Jr. will be able to rescue us, Yi Guipin thought to herself. Yi Guipin thought that if Fan Xian truly forced the Crown Prince into a situation where he could not retreat, the Crown Prince could only risk the condemnation of the world and use bloody methods to subdue the hearts of the officials. At that time, she and her son would probably not be able to survive. In the front of Hanguang Palace, everyone was silent. The entire palace was enveloped in an oppressive and tense atmosphere. The Crown Prince and Empress sat on either side of the Empress Dowager and gently massaged the old woman's back. This mother and son situation was much more relaxed than Yi Guipin's. They also knew that nothing could happen to this old woman under their fists. Aunt. The Empress glanced at the Empress Dowager and timidly said, the third prince's life is very fortunate. She glanced again. To be able to survive like this, it looks like Fan Xian, that traitor, has taught him many things. The crown prince furrowed his brows and saw the skin on his grandmother's temple tighten slightly. He knew that his mother's words had stupidly angered the Empress Dowager. He huffed coldly and said, "As long as my brother is alive, let's not talk about anything else for now." The Empress Dowager forcefully breathed a few times and suppressed the anger in her heart. She warmly patted the back of the crown prince's hand, thinking that of all the descendants of the royal family, probably only the crown prince truly understood what she was thinking. Thinking of this, the Empress Dowager increasingly felt that her choice was not wrong. Qing Kingdom indeed needed a filial child like the crown prince to manage. "You can all leave." The Empress Dowager coughed. Her mind was particularly tired. She waved her hand. All of the serving eunuchs, serving girls, and old nannies accepted their orders and left. Even the somewhat dissatisfied empress was chased out of the palace. Only she and the crown prince were left in the palace. The Empress Dowager turned around and looked at the crown prince with listless eyes. Holding the crown prince's hand, she faintly said, "I don't want you brothers to kill each other. That is why I am supporting this body and watching all of this. I am very pleased that you understand this." The crown prince did not reply. He only sighed. Perhaps he was thinking of his brother, Fan Xian. The Empress Dowager's gaze immediately became cold. It was as if she had seen through the crown prince's heart. As an emperor, you must be decisive and lenient when necessary. As for Fan Xian, he is an evil thief who plotted to assassinate your father. His surname is Fan, not Li. What is the point of thinking so much? The crown prince lowered his head in acceptance. I understand. Some people cannot be let go. It is a pity that we still did not catch him. The Empress Dowager slowly closed her eyes. Where are Shu Wu and the other officials being held? In the Ministry of Justice's prison. The crown prince laughed bitterly. It is not good to place them in the Overwatch Council Celestial Prison. However, for some reason, these officials have been deceived by Fan Xian. They are so muddle-headed that they refuse to submit. The Empress Dowager laughed coldly. Deceived? They are just a bunch of pedantic people. Only your father would allow them to be so presumptuous. Perhaps they have already seen the posthumous edict in Fan Xian's hand, which is why they dare to be so stubborn. The crown prince's expression changed slightly. He immediately calmed down and said, "There is no posthumous edict." Correct. The Empress Dowager looked at him with approval. So, how do you think we should deal with these officials who speak nonsense and threaten the royal family? The crown prince's expression changed again. He knew the Empress Dowager wanted him to make up his mind. After a long time, he said in a low voice, "We will kill them if we need to." Very good. The Empress Dowager's expression gradually became cold. If you want to be steady, then don't be afraid of killing. However, the subordinates of the Overwatch Council do not obey the Emperor's orders at all. It is a bit troublesome, the Crown Prince said after thinking for a while. Many officials in Jingdo were assassinated today. The people are panicking, and the court is in chaos. Fan Xian is hiding in the dark and managing everything. I can't think of a good way to deal with him. Fan Xian is using blood and heads to intimidate the court officials with the intention of throwing Jingdo into chaos. The Empress Dowager looked at her grandson and quietly said, "What do you want to say? Just say it." The Crown Prince was silent for a moment. He then raised his head and said in a firm tone, "I would like to ask the Empress Dowager to move the army into the capital to suppress it." Hanguang Palace once again quieted down. After a long time, the Empress Dowager slowly said, "Today, in Taiji Palace, Yan Hangshu already had this suggestion. How was it rejected in the end?" The Crown Prince laughed bitterly and shook his head. No one thought that after all the scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs were imprisoned, someone else would jump out today. The person who jumped out in court today did not have a high position, but his identity was special. He was the imperial censor of the left of the imperial censorate, He Zongwei. He Zongwei had always been on the Eastern Palace's side. Later, he had helped the eldest princess chase Prime Minister Lin Ruofu out of Jingdo. Furthermore, he had always had an unexplainable grudge with the Fan Manor. The Crown Prince had always thought that this person would be a pillar of his court in the future. He had not expected that when he was about to move the army into the capital and issue an edict, this person would jump out to oppose it. He Zongwei's opposition was extreme. He took off his official robes and took off his black veil. Leading a dozen imperial censors, he knelt in front of Taiji Palace. In a rage, the Crown Prince hit him 12 times and chased him out of the palace. But, this once famous scholar in Jingdo knelt in front of the palace walls covered in blood and did not yield a single step. Imperial censor He's opposition is very reasonable, the Empress Dowager said tiredly. The Empress Dowager lowered her eyelids slightly and tiredly said, "Actually, I have never had the Qin family enter the capital because I was worried about this problem. The court's ancestors strictly forbade the military from entering the capital to interfere in politics. Once this precedent is set, I'm afraid there will be endless trouble in the future." The Crown Prince was silent. He understood the Empress Dowager's worries. The Empress Dowager still hoped that he could peacefully take over. Once the military was involved, the Qin and Yi families would grow. He did not have supreme authority in the military like his father. What would the future Qin kingdom become? The Qin family has been loyal for generations. There is no need to worry, the Empress Dowager said coldly. She had a deep relationship with the Qin family, so there was no need to worry about this problem. But what about the Yi family? Yi Zhong is your second brother's father-in-law. The Empress Dowager looked at the silent Crown Prince and took a deep breath. She then sinisterly said, "However, Fan Xian, this shady person's actions are too crazy. If there is no army to suppress him, Jingdo will never be able to stabilize. Even if you kill a dozen officials in prison, what good will it do? If the situation drags on for a few more days, once the morale of the other 5 elite armies of the Qin kingdom becomes unstable, the situation will be worrisome." The Crown Prince bowed silently and said, "Therefore, I need the army to enter the capital. Compared to future troubles, the present Fan Xian is a dagger placed in front of us." He furrowed his brows slightly and said, "However, what about He Zongwei? After all, he is the imperial censor of the left. He has a group of imperial censors under him who are famous for not being afraid of death. They are playing a death remonstrance outside the palace walls." The Crown Prince's worry was not without reason. Killing officials was not rare in history, but killing an imperial censor was a great taboo. Even with the Qing Emperor's supreme authority, the Qing Emperor had only struck the imperial censors a few times to show his sincerity when they collectively attacked his illegitimate son, Fan Xian. There will always be people who need to be evil. The Empress Dowager stared into the Crown Prince's eyes and lovingly said, "Let me order these people to be dealt with." The Empress Dowager paused and then said, "After the army enters the capital, you can hand over your brother's position as commander." The Crown Prince bowed sincerely, moved speechlessly. In Guangxin Palace, not far from Hanguang Palace, the eldest princess, who had made this plan from the beginning and then began to coldly watch the countless characters act on the stage, finally sank into worry for the first time. The things that had happened today made her feel that something was strange. Why have we still not caught Fan Xian? She looked at Eunuch Ho beside her and asked coldly, "It's not that the internal court doesn't have aces. It's not that the Jingdo government hasn't put in effort. How long do I need to wait before I can see his head?" She said these words in front of her daughter. Lin Wan listened with a slight smile at the side. It seemed that she was not worried at all about her husband's safety. A few days had already passed. Since the palace had no way of catching him, then he would never be caught. After chasing Eunuch Ho out of the palace, the eldest princess's expression immediately changed. It was calm. It was impossible to tell that she had been so angry earlier. She knew that Fan Xian would not be so easy to catch. Since this young man was able to return alive from Dong Mountain, it proved his ability. This was a situation that involved the entire world. The focus of the eldest princess's thoughts had always been on Dong Mountain and not Jingdo. From the beginning, she had not thought that Fan Xian would be able to return to Jingdo alive. This point had already shaken her mind to its core. If Fan Xian lived, then Yan Xiaoyi would die. Li Yunrui lowered her eyelids slightly. The coldness in her eyes was slightly restrained. She thought about Fan Xian's present cultivation. Just what realm had he reached? He dared to so arrogantly and wantonly use assassination methods in Jingdo to challenge the authority of the royal palace. She suddenly furrowed her brows and looked at the cold and cheerless Guangxin Palace. This palace gives off the smell of death. I want to go out. Lin Wan looked calmly at her mother and said, "You're afraid. What do I have to be afraid of? Afraid that Fan Xian will break into the palace tonight?" The eldest princess gently patted her daughter's slightly thin cheek and said, "I understand Fan Xian too well. He will always be an assassin and a mouse who plays in the dark. He never has the courage to face his enemies head-on, because he is more afraid of death than anyone else." The eldest princess tilted her head slightly and looked at her daughter. "I've been thinking about a question. If I used your life to threaten him, what would he do? I am very curious about the answer to this question." The eldest princess smiled happily. "That is why I am waiting for Fan Xian to kill his way in front of me." Fan Xian still thought he had seen the Empress Dowager's thoughts clearly. The grandmother of the Li family hoped for a peaceful handover and did not want the wild and uncontrollable power of the army to turn the entire Qin kingdom into a mess. Thus, he had methodically carried out his arrangements. It was clear that he had underestimated his dark killing god image and how valiant he was in the hearts of the nobles in the royal palace. He had not thought that his assassination in Jingdo had finally provoked the Empress Dowager and the Crown Prince to a certain degree, forcing them to prepare to move the army into the capital to suppress it. The next day, the Jingdo garrison in the Yuantai camp would enter the capital to suppress it. If Fan Xian had not been able to control the royal palace before then, what awaited him was certain to be a wretched ending. He had also not thought that when the Qin family's army entered the capital, it would be forcefully delayed by a knight by He Zongwei, the servant of the three surnames he had always looked down on and deeply loathed, with a hot-blooded and valiant attitude. In this sense, He Zongwei had done him a great favor. The Empress Dowager and the Crown Prince's determination was clearly a day late. It was a deep and quiet night. The knight fell into a deep sleep. It was time for the Imperial Army's shift. The Imperial Army controlled the front half of the palace in the Royal Palace as well as a number of important streets outside the Royal Palace. Presently, the situation was tense. The Imperial Army on shift were temporarily stationed in the private houses on these streets, not daring to return to the camp to wait for orders. A group of about 200 Imperial Army soldiers, fully armored, walked with unusual calmness to the main palace doors. They exchanged defensive procedures and orders with the Imperial Army on shift. Due to the current situation, the commander of the Imperial Army, the Great Prince, had not returned to his manor for 3 days. He stood on the palace walls and looked coldly at the exchange below. After a slight pause, he slowly walked down. Dressed in armor, he stood in the palace doors like a god, about to block all attacks from outside the royal palace. He looked coldly at this group of 200 Imperial Army soldiers. A moment later, he silently nodded his head. The trusted officer at his side swallowed and nervously went forward to go through all the procedures. He then waved his hand to allow the group of clearly unfamiliar Imperial Army soldiers to walk into the royal palace. The great prince stood in the palace doors and allowed the Imperial Army soldiers who had come to take over to split into two lines and walk past him. This group of Imperial Army soldiers who had come to take over left silently and with strict military discipline. When the last group of Imperial Army soldiers were about to walk through the palace doors, the great prince suddenly sighed. The person at the back of the Imperial Army group nodded gently at him. "Commander, what do we do next?" The officer was the great prince's trusted aide and a general who had climbed up from the Western Expedition Army. Logically speaking, it was not his place to personally handle such a small matter as the exchange of guards. However, he knew that he had to handle this exchange of guards himself. Seeing the Imperial Army soldiers gradually disappear on the thick palace walls, the officer swallowed and forcefully suppressed the fear in his heart. He asked for instructions in a trembling voice. The great prince slowly tightened his grip on the sword at his waist. Facing the night wind, the lines of his face appeared particularly hard. "Have everyone wake up. An emergency military meeting." The moment he said this, a thick killing intent appeared around him. Although the great prince was not a martial expert, he had fought on the battlefield all year round. Countless souls had died under his sword. Since he had made up his mind tonight, the first thing he had to do was take care of the restless factor within the Imperial Army. The officer knew that the commander was going to kill tonight. The trusted aides of Yan Xiaoyi's faction in the Imperial Army were probably going to be completely slaughtered. However, he was no longer afraid. Boundless excitement rose from the bottom of his heart. He immediately began to pass on the orders. The front wall of the Imperial Palace was extremely wide, and 4 horses could run side by side on it. It was completely made of green bricks, and naturally exuded an austere aura. A row of Imperial guards was arranged in formation, looking at the square below the Imperial city. They were on guard, seemingly ready to receive an attack from outside the Imperial Palace at any time. However, one of the Imperial guards looked into the palace with a profound gaze. Fan Xian gently tidied up the Imperial soldier's clothing and looked at the familiar palace. It was pitch black inside. He didn't know where his family was or where his enemies were. He knew that if he led 200 people into the palace, he would face the internal guards and internal court eunuch aces. No one knew what the chances of success were for such a risk. It was because he could not determine whether the first prince would be able to completely control the Imperial guards when the sounds of killing rang out. He could not rely on the strength of the Imperial Army. Never do what the enemy wants you to do. The reason is very simple, because the enemy wants you to do that. Fan Xian said to Jinggu, the deputy commander of the Black Knights beside him. That's what a man called Napoleon said. The doors to the royal palace have already opened, but the doors to the rear palace are still closed. They didn't think we would dare to use so few people to attack the royal palace. He still did not know the eldest princess' evaluation of him. If this had been the Commissioner Fan of the past, the immortal poet, he would indeed not have chosen such a direct and brave attack. Chapter 552. I had arrived home last night and was indeed very tired. I raised my hands in a salute. The royal palace was even more thick-skinned than the nobility in Jingdo. One could ride horses up and store goods down. Even the room where the Imperial Army discussed official business was set up between large pieces of stone. In the darkness, there was a sense of sternness. Only a few flickering lights shone on the faces and eyes of everyone in the room, waking them up with a start. These Imperial Army generals and officers were indeed very tired. Ever since the 3 riders had returned from the capital and reported what had happened at Dong Mountain, a storm was brewing in Jingdo. The royal palace they were responsible for surrounding and protecting had become the eye of the storm that various powers were watching closely. For a number of days, not a single general could leave the royal palace. Even when it was their turn, no one returned to their manors to rest. The flames in the great prince's eyes became a burning light. He looked faintly at the dozen generals in the room and said in a cold voice, "Did you all hear what I said clearly?" The room was completely silent. A general knelt on one knee with a heavy expression. Gritting his teeth, he said, "I am not sure. You want me to read the posthumous edict again?" The great prince stared into his eyes and said in a cold voice, "The crown prince colluded with northern Qi and Dongi assassins to assassinate the previous emperor on Dong Mountain with the intention of usurping the throne. Later, he framed Sir Fan Jr. Since I have accepted the previous emperor's posthumous edict, those who deserve to be executed will be executed." The general glanced at the thin piece of paper by the great prince's side and narrowed his eyes. "Your Highness, who knows if the so-called posthumous edict is real or fake?" The great prince looked at him coldly. He then slowly took out a box from his clothes and placed it on the table. The box was opened. Inside was a small seal. It was the emperor's royal seal that had been missing for a number of days and that the palace's edicts had been unable to comply with. Once the royal seal appeared, the expressions of all the generals in the room changed dramatically. They all knelt on the ground and bowed toward the royal seal. No one dared to say anything more. "We solemnly obey your Highness's military orders. Sir Fan Jr. was ordered to eradicate the rebels and ordered me to help." The great prince's gaze slowly slid across the faces of the generals kneeling on the ground. He saw many people's thoughts. Although he had listened to Fan Xian's advice and placed many trusted aides in the imperial army after leading the imperial army, there were still many remnants of power left behind by Yan Xiaoyi's control of the imperial army. If he wanted to rely on the royal seal and posthumous edict, he would have to make these people wholeheartedly work for him. The corners of the great prince's eyes twitched. He laughed coldly in self-mockery. There had never been such a simple thing in the world. Generals who are willing to follow this king to save the country in this time of crisis, please stand up. The great prince spoke calmly. The light given off by the oil lamps in the corner of the room enveloped his face, making it seem as if blood was seeping out of his face. All of the generals in the room stood up. Their power was greater than the people. At this moment, the room was filled with the great prince's trusted lieutenants. Even if the generals had other thoughts, they did not dare to make things difficult in front of him. The general who had come out to speak tasted bitterness in his mouth. He had long maintained contact with the eldest princess in the palace. He had not thought that the great prince would suddenly make things difficult tonight and gather all of the generals in the secret room for a meeting. Furthermore, the message had been sent so quickly that he did not have a sliver of time to react. All of the generals of the imperial army were in the room. No one was left out. If the great prince chose to kill, no one would be able to resist. Thus, Yan Xiaoyi's former subordinates could only feign civility for now. Zhang Hao, Chen Yijiang. The great prince suddenly opened his mouth and called out the names of 5 generals. The expressions of the 5 generals became cold. They met each other's eyes and felt a glimmer of inauspiciousness. They walked out of the ranks. These 5 were all subordinates that Yan Xiaoyi had promoted when he was still alive. The great prince looked coldly at these 5 people. He paused for a moment and then faintly said, "You all know why I have called you out." A general's face was ashen. With a thud, he knelt before the great prince and said, "Your Highness. I will definitely follow your Highness's lead and will not have any ulterior motives." The great prince looked at him and nodded. He said warmly, "I'll have to trouble you to stay in this room for half a day. How about that?" The general's expression changed. In the end, he still nodded and retreated to the wall. The other 4 people felt extremely complicated emotions. If they were guarded by the great prince's personal soldiers in this secret room, how could they send a message to the palace? The four of them met each other's eyes. It was still the person who had spoken who spoke. His surname was Chen Yijiang. He was a trusted aide that Yan Xiaoyi had personally promoted. He knew that since the great prince had rebelled today, he would not be tolerated no matter what. Furthermore, his identity was set. He could not just wait to be tied down. Chen Yijiang was silent for a moment. He then said, "Your Highness, of the 2,000 imperial soldiers on the palace walls, at least 600 or 700 are the subordinates of the five of us. May I ask, if you don't have our help, how will you subdue all of the imperial soldiers?" He abruptly raised his head and smiled coldly. The Jingdo garrison can enter the capital at any moment. A third of the imperial army has been moved to Dong Mountain. What can we use to oppose those tigers and wolves? I would like to ask you to reconsider to prevent yourself from losing your life. Although these words were harsh, the silent officers in the room all knew that this was Chen Yijiang's final struggle to put on a brave front but weak heart. I never need to think about things that I have already thought about. The great prince looked coldly at Chen Yijiang. A murderous intent gradually rose in his eyes. It was a cold murderous intent that had been honed while fighting against the Hu people in the west. Chen Yijiang's heart trembled. Hot blood rushed to his head. With an angry roar, his hand gripped the knife at his waist. With a clang, he pulled it out of its sheath and charged toward the great prince. The angry roar stopped in the middle. The knife also fell to the ground. 3 long spears pierced Chen Yijiang's body with unusual coldness and brutality, piercing through his body and leaving him suspended in midair. Blood sprayed out of Chen Yijiang's mouth. He looked with unwillingness and despair at the great prince 3 feet away. His body twitched a few times on the long spear before he hung his head and died. At the same time that Chen Yijiang pulled out his knife and charged over, the other 3 generals Yan Xiaoyi had left behind also pulled out their knives. Bravely and hopelessly, they charged over. However, the room was full of the great prince's trusted aides. There were only a few whooshing sounds as the knife flashed a few times under the red light. The bodies fell to the ground. The smell of blood gradually rose. The 4 generals of the imperial army died sullenly. The great prince looked calmly at the bodies at his feet. Suddenly, he turned his head to glance at the last general. He saw that the man's legs were trembling but did not have the courage to go forward. He couldn't help but shake his head and quietly curse something. "Watch carefully," the great prince ordered his trusted aide. Without turning his head, he walked out of the meeting room. Walking up to the top of the royal palace walls, the great prince stood in a corner tower. His palm gently stroked the city-guarding crossbow that had been locked in place. His gaze followed the large crossbow bolts shining with black light and looked toward the square outside the royal palace, as well as the 4 streets outside the square already controlled by the imperial army. Following the commander's orders, those 600 people are all on duty and resting. The officer who had personally arranged for Fan Xian to lead the group into the palace stood behind the great prince and reported in a low voice. After using a day and a half's time to tamper with the imperial army's rotation, the great prince finally succeeded in moving the 600 or so imperial army soldiers out of the royal palace without alerting the 4 generals who had already died. The great prince faintly said, "Are you ready?" The officer raised his head and glanced at the great prince. Resolutely, he reported, 1,200 people have already surrounded them. We can move at any time. At this moment, there were already 1,200 subordinates loyal to the first prince in the resting area of the imperial guards. They had snuck in through the night and surrounded the 600 soldiers. With one order, they would raise the butcher's knife and clean out the last of the unstable elements in the imperial army. Those soldiers should still be sleeping. The great prince's expression was complicated. Dying in their sleep should be pretty good. Back then, the great prince had personally led tens of thousands of troops on an expedition to the west and achieved great feats by the side of Shi Hu. What was most praised about him, as well as his virtue of having the soldiers die for him, was that he always loved his soldiers like they were his children. However, kindness did not lead an army, particularly when it came to matters concerning the future of the Qing kingdom. The great prince's heart was like stone. "We await the commander's orders." The trusted aide did not know what the great prince was thinking and felt a bit anxious. He thought to himself that Xiaofan Jr. had already entered the palace. If the great prince suddenly became soft-hearted, no one knew what would happen in the morning. Thus, he had said such a reminder and carefully urged him. The great prince smiled self-mockingly and pulled his gaze back from the private residences in the dark night. He turned his head to look at the royal palace shrouded in darkness. He looked for a long time and still did not give the order because the rear palace was still very calm. When to act is not up to me to decide. The great prince gently patted the heavy city-guarding crossbow under his palm. If we act first, we'll probably startle the people in the palace. Fan Xian will decide when to act. He looked at the quiet depths of the palace and couldn't help but shake his head. He was actually very similar to the city-guarding crossbows on the palace walls. Although they were powerful, their hands and feet were bound by something tangible or intangible. They could only point the tips of the arrows outside the palace and could not bear to point them inside. The entire royal palace was divided into 3 areas. At the very back was the little building in the cold palace, Autumn Garden. There were no nobles living there. It was basically a forgotten corner. The area surrounded by the walls of the royal palace in Junlin Square was a group of stately buildings, including Taiji Palace. The Qing emperor and his officials discussed and decided all of the Qing kingdom's matters in these buildings. The place where the nobles lived was behind Taiji Palace. It was made up of countless palaces. Internal guards and internal court eunuchs were responsible for managing and guarding it. It was commonly referred to as the rear palace. Many people thought that once they entered the royal palace, they would be able to smoothly enter the rear palace. They seemed to have forgotten how much the emperor, a different kind of male creature, cared about his territory and his female. The emperors of each dynasty had always kept a close eye on this matter because they had too many women. No matter how talented they were, it was inevitable that they would be neglected too much. Naturally, they became the most easily cuckolded masters in the world. In order to not be cuckolded, the emperors invented eunuchs. They built high walls in the middle of the rear palace and the front palace and scattered a large number of guards they trusted. Thus, in history, the perverts who had something to do with the concubines in the rear palace could not escape the 3 types of people: guards, doctors, and eunuchs. Although the high walls of the rear palace could not stop the affairs of the palace from reaching out, they successfully stopped many people who wanted to rebel. History had long proven this point. 100 years ago, during the Wei Kingdom, there was once a civil official who took advantage of the emperor's inspection tour to deliberately plot a rebellion. Like Fan Xian tonight, he only brought 1,000 people to attack the royal palace. Mysteriously, he passed through the imperial army's defenses and was about to succeed. However, the empress, who had been left in the back palace, brought a large group of guards, eunuchs, and serving girls and successfully blocked the rebellious soldiers outside the palace doors. In the end, this daring civil official discovered in despair that the women, and eunuchs were even more powerful than the imperial army. They sealed him outside the palace for 3 days. In the end, this rebel ended up dead. Other than the empress' calmness and bravery, the unity of the eunuchs, serving girls, and guards in the palace that successfully stopped this rebellion, the most important reason was that the high walls the emperor used to keep women were too strong. Where there was a wall, there must be a door, unless it was an underground tomb. Additionally, because humans never liked to crawl in and out of a window opened by God, no matter how tightly guarded a building was, there would always be all kinds of doors. If there was a door, there would be someone who could open it. Thus, determining whether a place was easy to attack or not, the crux was not how thick the door was or whether the bolt inside was made of steel. Rather, it was whether you had control of the person who opened the door. Mao Zedong and many great people had said that the ultimate truth that determined everything was people. Fan Xian dared to attack the rear palace unexpectedly because he had control of the person who opened the door. 200 imperial soldiers followed their usual route and carried out a silent and nervous patrol. They moved west on the high walls of the royal palace. Just as they were about to reach the starlight, a cloud suddenly passed by. The starlight gradually dimmed, and the top of the city walls darkened. The imperial soldiers walked down the stone stairs that went back and forth. There was not a speck of light in Taiji Palace. Occasionally, a few guards carrying lanterns and eunuchs responsible for keeping the night watch could be seen walking by with hunched backs. This group of imperial soldiers gathered at the foot of the palace walls closest to the rear palace. Then, they scattered like the wind. Fan Xian looked coldly at his subordinates. Like countless eagles, they spread out and pounced toward the remaining people and lights in the front palace. In an instant, the lights arrived. A number of guards were silently stabbed to death. He nodded. These 200 people were a mixed force. 100 of the 500 Black Knights had been transferred. The other 100 were the last batch of assassins that had been taken from the 6th Bureau. Working in the dark, they were indeed ruthless and powerful. The deputy commander of the Black Knights, Jing Gu, who was following beside him, glanced at him and then at the high walls of the rear palace about a dozen feet away. In a low voice, he asked, "Attack by force?" Fan Xian's gaze flicked to an inconspicuous door at the bottom of the palace wall. He shook his head and said, "We'll go through the door." Go through the door? Jing Gu glanced at the commissioner with surprise. He thought, Sir's words were truly wondrous. Had he learned the legendary ability to walk through the walls of the temple during his trip to Dong Mountain? Fan Xian ignored him and took off the heavy imperial army armor on his body, revealing the tight-fitting black nocturnal clothing underneath. Using the cover of the trees in front of the palace, he approached the door. Jing Gu made a hand gesture behind him. The members of the small assault team scattered in the darkness immediately flew back like bats. With Fan Xian as the center, they formed two straight lines and stuck closely to the palace wall of the rear palace. Jing Gu also followed and stood 6 feet behind Fan Xian. Raising his head to glance at the wall, he thought that it wasn't too high. At least half of the 200 people could climb over it. The clouds in the sky parted slightly. A bright moon shone through the light clouds. The silver moonlight shone on Jing Ji's silver mask. It was very beautiful. Fan Xian stood in front of the door and gently knocked under the moon. His knuckles landed gently on the heavy wooden door and made a light buzzing sound. There was no reply from behind the wooden door. Immediately after, there was the sound of the door spring moving. The faces of the 200 black-clothed people hiding on either side of Fan Xian involuntarily revealed shock. They had followed Sir Fan Jr. into the royal palace on the previous emperor's posthumous edict. Although these 200 people were courageous and loyal, they had tragically prepared themselves to die. Unexpectedly, Sir Fan Jr. had so gently knocked on the door of the rear palace. In this instant, all of the subordinates who had killed their way into the royal palace immediately felt a boundless respect for Fan Xian in their hearts. Their confidence in the success or failure of the night also multiplied. The wooden door of the rear palace was very thick. It was clear that the traitor inside was struggling to open the door. Fan Xian closed his eyes and pressed his palm against the wooden door. Suddenly, he furrowed his brows. Circulating the Jinqi in his body slightly, the gentle Tianyi Dao Jinqi traveled along his palm to the door and shook it open about the width of 2 people. Very gently, he opened the door without making a single sound. Fan Xian flashed through the door like a gust of wind. He then glanced at the eunuch behind the door who was looking at him with a nervous and frightened gaze. He nodded slightly and said, "You've worked hard." Eunuch Dai swallowed and glanced at the dense darkness around him with some fear. He didn't say anything. The eldest princess probably had not thought that there would be someone in the present royal palace who would risk the danger of having his entire family executed to be a traitor to Fan Xian. No one would have thought that this traitor would be Eunuch Dai, who had long lost his former power and was just a normal and pitiful old eunuch. Fan Xian had once done Eunuch Dai a favor, at least 3 times. However, this eunuch was willing to take such a great risk to help Fan Xian, not just to repay the favor. For one, he wanted to help Fan Xian regain the power he had lost and particularly missed. For another, he had a deep connection to Fan Xian these years. If the crown prince truly became emperor, he probably wouldn't even be able to think about his position in the laundry office. He would just be waiting for death. Most importantly, Eunuch Dai knew that his nephew had always been under Fan Xian's surveillance. Eunuch Dai was still counting on his nephew to take care of him when he died. Eunuch Dai looked around in fear. He was actually a bit confused. Why had he opened the door so smoothly? Why had the guards watching all around not noticed him? "Sir, I will lead the way for you," opening the palace door that was wide enough for 2 people. Black-clothed people occasionally floated in. These black-clothed people moved very quickly. In a moment, they had all charged into the rear palace and each chose a place to hide themselves. Eunuch Dai looked at this scene and felt his heart tremble. He knew that these were the subordinates Sir Fan Jr. was using to cause chaos in the palace. However, it seemed that there were too few people. "Find a place to pretend to be dead," Fan Xian said quietly to Eunuch Dai. The determination in his eyes gradually grew stronger. His familiarity with the geography of the royal palace was something no one could imagine. From the first time he had entered Hanguang Palace to steal the key, he had calculated countless times in his manner about the sudden attack and retreat routes in the palace. Opportunities were always given to those who were prepared. Hearing this, Eunuch Dai quickly bent his body and disappeared into the darkness. Listening to Sir Fan Jr.'s words, he found a place that would not attract attention and pretended to be dead. On this side, the 200 Nightwalkers had already made their final preparations. Fan Xian glanced at Jing Gu. His thin lips opened slightly and spat out an incomparably cold word, "Attack." The mission had long been arranged before they entered the palace. He had spies in the palace that no one could guess. He also had all sorts of channels to help Fan Xian understand. He was very clear about the arrangements in the palace. He had divided these 200 people into 4 small groups. The most important were the 2 groups he and Jing Gu would lead. Fan Xian would lead the 6th Bureau assassins and swordsmen straight into Hanguang Palace. They had to rescue Lady Ning, Yi Gui Pin, and the 3rd prince from the Empress Dowager's personal watch before the people in the palace could react. This was the most important thing. The great prince dared to lead the imperial army in rebellion because he believed Fan Xian could rescue his mother. Fan Xian could not disappoint his brother, who trusted him so much. Jing Gu mainly led the lone aces of the Black Knights. They had to charge straight for Guangxin Palace with the momentum of a sudden attack, hoping to strike in one blow. Because the eldest princess was in Guangxin Palace, if he didn't kill this woman, Fan Xian would always feel that there was a poisonous snake watching him. Fan Xian had already found out that Wan, and Dabao were in Guangxin Palace. However, he didn't personally go to Guangxin Palace. For one, Hanguang Palace was more important. For another, perhaps he was unconsciously afraid of facing that kind of situation, so he had Jing Gu lead the army? The 200 black-clothed people were like 200 ghosts. Under the faint moonlight, they split into countless lines and followed the arrowhead as they headed toward various places in the rear palace. Fan Xian headed quickly in the direction of Hanguang Palace. As he passed by flowers, trees, lakes, and pavilions, he met a few guards. Third duty armed guards. Fan Xian didn't even glance at the guard standing to the side. He only said in his heart that the guards responsible for patrolling this area were third duty guards. It looked like that little guy hadn't failed. The reason he didn't look at these guards was because the guards along the way could no longer move. Perhaps it was because they had been poisoned or cursed, but the eyes of the guards closest to the palace door's eunuch Dai had opened spun wildly. They couldn't make a sound. Their entire bodies were stiff. No wonder eunuch Dai had opened the palace doors for Fan Xian so smoothly. This scene was very strange. The guards responsible for guarding the rear palace looked at the black-clothed people floating in front of their eyes and were unable to react. With a number of swishing sounds, the last two 6th Bureau swordsmen in Fan Xian's group pulled out metal drills and cleanly slit the throats of these guards, killing them. It also allowed them to finally escape this nightmarish emotional disturbance. Passing the trees, flowers, lakes, and pavilions, Hongguang Palace was right in front of them. Fan Xian swung his hand and a hidden crossbow shot out. It nailed to death a night guard eunuch who had discovered him and opened his mouth to scream. Fan Xian needed speed. He needed the feeling of sudden attack and killing that speed brought. He needed this feeling to shock everyone in the palace. Thus, he didn't care if his figure was exposed. The medicine could only be used on a group of guards. It could only ensure that the guards would discover him a bit later. He had never had the extravagant hope that he would lead 200 people into the royal palace and stand in front of the Empress Dowager's bed without a single guard discovering him. It was only a matter of time before he was discovered. Hongguang Palace was less than 300 feet away from this group of assassins in the night who had shot out like arrows from a bow. Suddenly, a cry of surprise came from a distant place behind him. The sound of a number of weapons clashing rang out. Fan Xian didn't turn his head, but he could tell that it wasn't in the direction of Guangxin Palace. It should be the other two groups of subordinates preparing to find their way into the palace to confuse the guards. His heart tightened. A drop of cold sweat seeped out of his forehead. He knew his whereabouts had finally been discovered. Release, disperse. Fan Xian's figure did not stop. His right hand tightened into a fist and then quickly dispersed. Seeing this order, the well-trained swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council immediately spread out behind him. Following the curved lake to the side of Hongguang Palace, they turned into countless curved lines. Circling around the path, they used the cover of the trees to head toward the cold and quiet palace. The Overwatch Council swordsman at the very back suddenly stopped his figure. His metal drill pierced into the ground. From his clothes, he took out a small tube. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the bright moon in the sky and pulled forcefully. The fireworks shot straight into the sky. In an instant, it clearly illuminated the quiet and dark royal palace. It also sent the clearest signal to the people hidden in all directions in Jingdo. The concealment had come to an end. They had officially entered the ambush. A knife flew over and sliced into the Overwatch Council swordsman's right shoulder. The swordsman was still holding the fireworks and did not dodge. Fresh blood flowed out. After he gave a muffled grunt, his left hand pulled back the metal drill from the ground and fought with the two guards leaping toward him from the side. Fan Xian was only 30 meters away from Hongguang Palace. He didn't go to see the fireworks. He didn't have time to worry about the life or death of his loyal subordinate. He only stared coldly at Hongguang Palace and discovered there was already movement inside. Involuntarily, his heart gradually grew cold. The reaction speed of the defense in the rear palace was truly much faster than he had estimated. Faster, faster. There seemed to be guards coming to their senses everywhere. Fan Xian was facing Hongguang Palace. His eyes narrowed slightly and his killing intent was released. The tyrannical Zhenqi in his body instantly rose to the limit his meridians could hold. He then stepped onto the stone railing on the side of the palace. The stone railing shattered. Using this powerful counterforce, Fan Xian flew up like a large black bird. Under the moonlight, he used a crude and arrogant posture to descend above Hanguang Palace, revealing his determination. At the highest point, his Zhenqi gradually slowed. His body showed signs of falling. He gave a muffled grunt and slammed his right hand down. Using the power of the coffin in the wall, he moved his body a few centimeters to the side and slammed it into the glazed tiles of Hanguang Palace. With one slap, the tiles flew wildly in the moonlight. It gave one the feeling that in this instant, the entire Hanguang Palace was shaking from the slap. No one could match Fan Xian's current speed. No one dared to block such an indomitable aura. Under the moonlight, he used the power of one slap to fly up again. Like a large bird spreading its wings, he landed on the roof of the palace. Then, he circulated his qi throughout his body and fell. With a loud crash, he smashed a large hole in Hanguang Palace with all the tyrannical Zhenqi in his body. Just as the serving girl in Hanguang Palace lit the first lantern in fear, the black-clothed Fan Xian landed like a stone on the floor in the back of Hanguang Palace. Beside him were shattered tiles and dust. Under his feet was the cracked stone floor that had been stepped on. Chapter 553. The dim light illuminated the side room of Hanguang Palace for the first time. A dim light seeped out from the palace lantern on the table, making the entire room seem a little gloomy. It was even less bright than the moonlight shining through the big hole in the ceiling. The serving girl looked at the dust-covered Fan Xian with a face full of terror. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. With a hiss, Fan Xian's feet crossed and he suddenly took 8 steps forward. His sword stabbed out horizontally, hitting the serving girl's throat. Blood sprayed out. Fan Xian's head was slightly lowered. His wrist turned slightly, and the emperor's sword in his hand came out again. It stabbed out strangely from under his armpit and pointed at a eunuch's throat. He hurriedly retreated another 3 steps. Using the tip of his left foot as a pivot, his entire body began to spin beautifully like a dancer. The emperor's sword in his hand shone with a cold light. Following this spin, it drew out a cold light several feet in front of him. Wherever the cold light passed, the eunuchs and palace maids who were startled awake all fell to the ground in pools of blood. His right foot stomped on the flagstone again, and the flagstone cracked slightly. Fan Xian's body was like a big bird that had been tied up. With a strange posture, he suddenly retreated and crashed fiercely into the chest of someone, breaking all the bones and tendons of that person. He lowered his head, and his right elbow suddenly shot out like a spring. The emperor's sword flew out of his hand and struck the chest of a person who was charging at him from the right. His swordless right fist suddenly punched to the left, knocking the last person to the ground. With a thud, that person did not even have time to react and fell heavily to the ground. His head was shattered like a watermelon. In the blink of an eye, he had killed 8 people. Fan Xian, who had ruthlessly charged into Hanguang Palace, didn't say a word. In the silence, he attacked with all his strength. The emperor's sword and tyrannical Zhenqi made him like a wandering spirit with unparalleled magic power. In a moment, he seized the lives of all the enemies in the room. He didn't let them make a single sound. His sword style was inherited from Siga Jian, but it lacked Siga Jian's indomitable heavenly killing intent. Instead, it had the shadow's natural coldness. His fist and palm techniques were inherited from the Yi family, but they didn't have Yi Liuyan's carefree and indifferent feeling of floating on the sea. Instead, there was a heroic feeling that came naturally from his tyrannical Zhenqi. Who could stop such a killing? Of the people in the side hall, other than those who had died on the ground, only Yi Guipin, her son, and Lady Ning remained. Lady Ning had come to see the third prince's injuries, so she did not return to her own quarters. On the contrary, it brought Fan Xian great convenience. None of the three nobles could sleep that night. When Fan Xian crashed into the palace like a god, they reacted at the first instant. Separated by a thin veil, they watched Fan Xian's every move nervously. No matter how much confidence they had in Fan Xian, they had not thought that Sir Fan Jr. would use such a violent method to kill off all the internal court personnel watching and protecting him in such a short time. Lifting the curtain, the three of them walked down and looked at Fan Xian. The expressions on their faces were all different, but they all had a glimmer of shock. They felt that the Fan Xian in front of them seemed to be different from the Fan Xian before Dong Mountain. Yi Guipin's face was full of joy. Since Fan Xian had taken the risk to kill his way into the palace to save her and her son, then the worries she had spoken to Qingping earlier did not exist. Being watched in Hanguang Palace, Yi Guipin didn't know when she and her son would die. Suddenly seeing her savior tonight, her state of mind relaxed. She then looked at the room full of dead bodies and broken limbs. Involuntarily, her legs weakened and she wanted to fall down. The third prince, Li Qingping, supported his mother's body and looked at his teacher with a grateful gaze. He nodded his head forcefully. His eyes were already wet. Deep in Hanguang Palace, countless guards had surrounded them from outside. The eunuch aces of the internal court were still present. Fan Xian knew that although his violent attack had successfully made contact with the three of them, he had not saved them. It was still a hopeless situation. Thus, he didn't waste any more words with the third prince and Lady Ning. Straightforwardly and coldly, he said, "Follow me and charge out." Charging out was easier said than done. Just based on the 200 people Fan Xian had brought into the palace, it was impossible to control the entire rear palace. Furthermore, he didn't know if the internal purge of the imperial army in the royal palace could be resolved before the situation became dangerous. Fan Xian pulled out his long sword from the eunuch's body and glanced at the silent Lady Ning out of the corner of his eye. Seeing the glimmer of a gratified smile on Lady Ning's face, he couldn't help but smile and take out the black dagger from his boot. The third prince's dagger had already been hidden in the thicket by the Chen corridor. Seeing his teacher take out the dagger, he thought it was for him to protect himself. Supporting his mother, he wanted to take a step forward. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian turned the dagger around and handed it to Lady Ning. Lady Ning held the slender black dagger. A heroic spirit immediately surged out of her. After all, she was a female slave who had survived the northern expedition. She had not forgotten the matter of iron and blood these years. Fan Xian didn't look at the three people again. Without wasting a moment, he walked directly toward the door of the side hall. This door did not lead outside the palace. It led to the front hall. If charging out of the palace was not easy, then it was better to charge into the palace. A palm pressed against the wooden door. Without any warning, it was as if the wooden door was made of paper. Pulled by countless powerful forces, it shattered and flew through the air. Before the wood shavings landed, Fan Xian's palm was already glued to a eunuch's palm. Fan Xian gave a muffled grunt. All of his jinqi surged forward. With just one exchange of palms, he had already felt the power of this eunuch. There were indeed hidden dragons and crouching tigers among the internal court guards. The disciples taught by old eunuch Hong were indeed not to be trifled with. Fresh blood flowed out of the eunuch's 5 senses. His body was being attacked by the tyrannical jinqi and could not withstand it at all. However, his mission was only to delay Fan Xian for a moment so that the aces in the front hall and the Empress Dowager could prepare. Fan Xian did not give him the opportunity to delay. Smoke rose between his palms. The poisonous fog headed straight for the face of the highly skilled eunuch. The eunuch's expression changed. Fan Xian's right hand shook. The long sword buzzed and sliced horizontally across his shoulder. This was the difference in power. Under the simultaneous attack of the tyrannical Zhenqi in poisonous fog, the eunuch had no energy left to react. He could only watch as the light flashed past his eyes. Fan Xian flipped his left wrist and put the emperor's sword into his sleeve. Without another glance at the eunuch ace, he crouched down slightly with both knees and crashed forward like a giant bird flying into the woods. He did not crash into the path where countless aces surged through. Instead, he crashed directly into the wall of the side hall. With a loud crash, he forcefully smashed a large hole in the wall made of wood and brick. Fan Xian did not care about the safety of the three people behind him. He swept directly into the large hole. At this moment, the neck of the eunuch ace standing frozen by the door made a thud and was severed in the middle. His bloody head fell down. Yi Guipin and her son stared dumbstruck at this scene. Lady Ning's face was heavy. Holding the black dagger Fan Xian had given her, she led the startled mother and son into the large hole. She guessed why Fan Xian was in such a hurry and why he had smashed through the large hole to enter the front hall. She also knew that before Fan Xian could control the situation, the safety of these three people completely depended on the dagger in her hand. What was needed for a sudden attack? It was to be as fast as lightning and as unexpected as wind and thunder on flat ground. Fan Xian's actions tonight carried out this purpose perfectly. From the moment he entered the rear palace to the moment he was discovered by the guards, his and his subordinates' speed suddenly increased. They swept through the rear palace like a wild wind. He stepped onto the stone railing, smashed the golden tiles, fell into the palace, and killed everyone. All of this happened in the time it takes for a spark to fly off a piece of flint. If one counted from the first cry of the guards, he had only spent the time of a dozen strikes to successfully kill his way into the core palace of Hongguang Palace. It was truly lightning-like speed. Not only did the enemy not have time to react, but Fan Xian did not even leave himself any time to think or judge. He relied on the intelligence he had gathered about the royal palace over the years, the spies in the palace, and his extraordinarily sensitive intuition to kill his way in. Of course, this action relied on the courage he had lacked the most in the past, the arrogance that came from throwing oneself into the jaws of death. When Fan Xian killed his way into Hongguang Palace at the fastest speed, the 50 or 66th Bureau swordsmen following him also spread out in a fan shape in the darkness and surrounded Hongguang Palace. However, these people had purposely suppressed their speed. At this moment, they just happened to arrive at the outskirts of Hongguang Palace. Fan Xian's calculations were very accurate. Although he had somewhat underestimated the reaction speed of the rear palace guards, these 50 or 66th Bureau swordsmen just happened to block the palace guards who were rushing over at a very fast speed. The Overwatch Council swordsmen were skilled in killing people in the dark. The palace guards were the elites of the Qing Kingdom's individual martial power. Although they were far from the tiger guards Fan Jian had secretly trained for the royal family, their martial power was still very powerful. Outside Hongguang Palace, killing broke out everywhere. In an instant, knives and swords clashed. Countless people were killed and blood sprayed out. In just a few breaths, the circle formed by dozens of black-clothed swordsmen was forced back a considerable distance toward Hongguang Palace. If one looked closely, one could see that these swordsmen's retreat was not passive. Rather, it was an active choice. Although it looked like they were being pushed back step by the guards, they had also pulled back the circle and tightly surrounded the main hall of Hongguang Palace. The smaller the defensive circle, the greater the rebound. Many people had already fallen. The black-clothed assassins had blocked the main door of Hongguang Palace. If the people inside wanted to escape, it would be very difficult. Furthermore, it should not be forgotten that Hongguang Palace was not calm at this moment. This was the tactic Fan Xian had drawn up. Surrounded by chaos on all sides and blossoming in the center. The loyal subordinates of the Overwatch Council relied on the darkness to contend with the increasing number of palace guards. In the center of the royal palace, Hanguang Palace, a bright and vicious flower was about to bloom. This flower had to be pinched between Fan Xian's fingers. At the beginning of the chaos in the palace, the guards and internal court aces reacted quickly. However, the nobles in the palace did not have this ability. The old nannies in Hanguang Palace opened their dazed eyes and silently cursed. They didn't know what had happened outside. A little serving girl with nimble legs heard the coughing on the bed and quickly climbed out to help up the mistress of the Qin kingdom. The Empress Dowager had been having a headache these days. There was a yellow thread tied around her forehead. She leaned tiredly in the arms of a serving girl. A glimmer of confusion flashed through her eyes. The old woman's hearing was not good, so she didn't hear the loud crash when Fan Xian crashed through the roof of the side hall. She also didn't hear the sound of Fan Xian killing 8 people in a flash. This old woman had lived in the palace for many years and had seen countless wild winds and waves. Her immersion in politics and conspiracies immediately alerted her. A cold light flashed through her eyes. She abruptly sat up from the serving girl's arms and shouted in a stern voice, "Close the palace doors. Everyone retreat in." The Empress Dowager's reaction could not be said to be slow. Since she guessed that there was chaos in the palace, the first thing she did was to gather all of her martial power and surround herself. She knew her weight. Since the enemy had entered the palace, she was the first target. Such a reaction was the same as the first time she had heard of her son's death. It was simple and precise. One had to admire it. However, she was destined to be disappointed tonight. Before she could gather her power, someone had already charged into the center of Hanguang Palace. Just as the first clash between the guards outside the palace and the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau rang out, a loud sound suddenly came from the wall behind Hanguang Palace. Bricks and wood flew everywhere, and a hole suddenly appeared. A black figure flew out from this hole, like an azure dragon walking in the night. In an instant, it flew across the sky, heading straight for the Empress Dowager's phoenix bed. The closest distance between the rooms was not the distance between the doors. Rather, it was the wall. 2 rooms appeared to be very far away. Sometimes, they were only separated by a half-foot thick wall. As long as one passed through the wall, the end of the world would be within reach. How many people in this world could be like Fan Xian, able to circulate the tyrannical Zhenqi throughout his body and use the pure heart of Tianyi Dao to protect his heart and meridians to prevent the tyrannical Zhenqi's backlash? Thus, he could turn himself into a large metal hammer and smash through the thick wall. Fan Xian, dressed in black, leaped toward the Empress Dowager with the power of wind and thunder. Along the way, the air gave out a wretched cry. One could imagine how terrifying his speed had been raised. From the hole in the wall to the bed the Empress Dowager sat on was a distance of 12 meters. On this path, the old nannies and serving girls who had only brushed against the edge of Fan Xian's clothes were all knocked to the ground by the tyrannical Zhenqi contained in every part of his body. Their clothes were disheveled, and they were knocked to the ground by blood. The eunuch aces, who had remained in the Empress Dowager's palace, finally moved. 4 roars rang out. 4 withered hands grabbed toward the rapidly advancing Fan Xian's body. Like an old tree blooming, they wanted to capture the giant dragon in the forest. Who knew how many years of pure Zhenqi could be cultivated in the 4 withered and old hands? The Empress Dowager sat peacefully in the palace. If she didn't have her own powerful martial power to protect her, how could she use Lady Ning's life to threaten the great prince, who held a large number of troops? After hearing the sound of the wall being torn apart like paper, the Empress Dowager had already turned her head and happened to see this scene. Her gaze was icy and full of confidence. It was as if Fan Xian, who was like a god right now, would become a corpse in the next moment. Contrary to everyone's expectations, Fan Xian did not slow down. However, the aura on his body suddenly disappeared in an instant. It was as if his entire person had suddenly disappeared in midair. His body was still flying, but the tyrannical Jinqi aura on his body had been completely withdrawn. His entire person appeared gentle, calm, and serene. Extremely tyrannical and extremely gentle, these two completely different kinds of Jinqi appeared at the same time on one person's body in an instant. The pupils of the four powerful eunuch aces constricted slightly. They felt shocked in their hearts. In their lives, not only had they never seen, but they had never heard of anyone who could cultivate two kinds of Jinqi that clashed so severely to the peak. Furthermore, these two kinds of Jinqi methods were clearly the best martial arts in the world. Although they were shocked, their hands did not slow down. They also did not lose their confidence. These were the four powerful internal court aces that Eunuch Hong led. They had always thought they were responsible for protecting the Empress Dowager's safety. They thought that no matter how powerful Fan Xian was, he would not be able to ignore the combined attack of the four of them. Fan Xian was not a great grandmaster, but he was the second fastest person in the world. Back then, on the meadow, not even the tip of Haitong's sword could pierce through his tumbling body. Now, his nature had changed and he had gradually merged the two kinds of Jinqi. There was only one Wu Zhu in this world. Fan Xian's body suddenly curled up in midair. He raised his left knee and twisted his right shoulder. His body trembled. Unable to borrow any strength in midair, he miraculously turned his body. He trembled for a moment and deviated slightly. The first withered hand grabbed Fan Xian's right shoulder. It was as if it had grabbed a ball of cloud and did not put any strength into it. The second withered hand grabbed Fan Xian's left arm. It grabbed the blade of the sword he had sinisterly hidden in his sleeve. The blade of the sword tore through the sleeve and cut a long wound on the palm that contained pure Jinqi, revealing the white bone inside. Fresh blood was stimulated by the Jinqi and sprayed out, drenching half of Fan Xian's body red. The third withered hand grabbed Fan Xian's right knee and tore off a piece of his clothing. The fourth withered hand missed. It only grabbed one of Fan Xian's shoes. Looking at this scene, a glimmer of coldness flashed through the Empress Dowager's eyes. Before the coldness retreated, a cold light flashed. Like a gust of wind, the sword in Fan Xian's left hand was already resting on the Empress Dowager's neck. Fresh blood dripped down from Fan Xian's torn sleeve and onto the Empress Dowager's clothes and face. Chapter 554. Inside the main hall of Hongguang Palace, there was a death-like silence. Everyone watched this scene with terrified eyes. Other than the light patter of blood dripping onto the bed, there was not a single sound. Fresh blood slid down Fan Xian's clothes and sword. It followed the Empress Dowager's earlobe and wet half of the old woman's face, gradually seeping into her clothes. The sword shining with a cold light rested with unusual stability and coldness on the Empress Dowager's neck. This was the first time since the founding of the Qing kingdom that an assassin had been able to kill his way into the depths of the royal palace and place the blade of a sword on the Empress Dowager's neck. Everyone, including the eunuch's aces, was stunned. They watched as Fan Xian held the Empress Dowager hostage and didn't know what to do. All of this happened too quickly. From the time the alarm sounded outside the hall to Fan Xian descending like a god of death, charging straight into the phoenix bed and controlling the Empress Dowager, only a few breaths had passed. Earlier, in the side hall, Fan Xian had not crashed into the wall. Instead, he had first chosen the wooden door and exchanged a blow with the eunuch ace. He had beheaded him with one strike, successfully making the aces of the internal court turn their attention to the long corridor that led from the side hall to the main hall. However, he had crashed directly into it from behind the wall. Only in such an unexpected and dangerous manner and forcefully withstanding the attacks of four old eunuchs had he succeeded. To be able to react so quickly and make such a decision in such a short amount of time, it had to be said that Fan Xian's actions tonight were truly valiant. Furthermore, for the people watching this scene in shock, for some reason, a chill rose from the bottom of their hearts. It was as if Fan Xian would pull back his sword at any moment and send the Empress Dowager to her death. Fan Xian's expression was too calm and cold. It was as if the person under his sword was a normal person and not the Empress Dowager who could affect the situation of the world. Send an order for the guards outside to stop. The inside of the hall was deathly silent. It served to make the wretched cries of killing outside grow louder. The 6th Bureau swordsmen who had broken into the palace were still fighting with the internal guards. After Fan Xian had the Empress Dowager under his sword, he did not hesitate at all. He bent his right knee slightly and carefully hid his body behind the Empress Dowager's back. Flipping his sword around, he rested it on the Empress Dowager's shoulder and moved closer to the Empress Dowager's blood-stained face. His words were very calm, but they carried a power that did not allow anyone to refute him. Everyone felt that if the Empress Dowager did not order the guards outside and the eunuch aces in the hall to stop, Fan Xian might actually take action. However, the Empress Dowager was not an ordinary person. When this Empress Dowager of the Qin Kingdom was still King Cheng, she had experienced many years of precarious days. Her personality was sincere and steady. She was not an ordinary old woman. Later on, she became the Empress and Empress Dowager for decades, living deep in the palace. She had a dignified and powerful confidence in her heart. The Empress Dowager turned her face and looked coldly at Fan Xian. Her white hair was slightly messy, but her eyebrows were furrowed together. She exuded an innate prestige and said in a cold voice, "You treacherous thing. How dare you threaten me?" Her voice was like cutting gold and breaking jade, shaking everyone in the palace. Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly. He had not thought that the Empress Dowager would be in such a wretched state. In such a dangerous situation, she would still be so unyielding. However, he knew that the Empress Dowager had to maintain her aura in order to obtain more benefits in the following matters. Something even more unexpected had yet to come. There was only a slap. The Empress Dowager had turned her hand and slapped Fan Xian across the face. A faint red palm print appeared on Fan Xian's face. The Empress Dowager did not seem to be afraid of the cold blade across her neck. Her eyes looking at Fan Xian were full of disdain and disdain. In a cold voice, she said, "Do you dare to kill me?" Everyone in Hongguang Palace was shocked. They had not thought that the Empress Dowager would still dare to provoke him so forcefully while being controlled by Fan Xian's blade. Was she not afraid that Fan Xian would actually kill her? Seeing this scene, some of the nannies and serving girls fainted in fear. The Empress Dowager continued to look at Fan Xian coldly and valiantly. Fan Xian's eyes narrowed. Looking at the Empress Dowager's wrinkled face, he didn't say a word. He knew why this old woman was acting so valiantly. She knew that if Fan Xian wanted to control the royal palace, then he would not dare to kill her right now. Furthermore, she was, after all, the Empress Dowager and Fan Xian's blood-related grandmother. She had predicted that Fan Xian would not act in front of so many people. Even if she was wrong, she still had to maintain her aura. Only then would she have a chance to reverse the situation. Just as the Empress Dowager slapped Fan Xian with unusual forcefulness, a change suddenly occurred in Hongguang Palace. Eunuch Ho, who had been standing quietly at the side of the palace, suddenly floated up. He floated up with unusual speed, but he did not charge toward Fan Xian and the Empress Dowager. Instead, he charged toward the large hole Fan Xian had made. A strange light flashed through Fan Xian's eyes, but he did not leave the Empress Dowager's side. He could only watch as Eunuch Ho and a few other eunuch aces restrained a few people beside the hole. Eunuch Ho's hand gripped the third prince's throat tightly. Yi Guipin was restrained by a eunuch. Lady Ning waved her black dagger but was also surrounded by a few eunuchs. "Little Duke, don't be too rash," Eunuch Ho said respectfully with his hand around the third prince's throat with his head lowered. Fan Xian's hand held the sword with unusual steadiness. Looking at Eunuch Ho, a strange light flashed through his eyes. It was only now that he knew that this second-in-command eunuch ranked below Eunuch Yao also had such a high level of cultivation. The current situation was that Fan Xian controlled the Empress Dowager while Eunuch Ho and the other eunuchs controlled the three people Fan Xian cared about. How would the situation develop? Everyone was waiting for Fan Xian's decision. The Empress Dowager's expression was cold, but the blood that had seeped into her clothes was slightly cold. It made her fingers tremble slightly. Fan Xian lowered his head and looked at the Empress Dowager's fingers. He was not silent for long. He only took a deep breath. All of the eunuch aces became alert. They didn't know what he would do next. Fan Xian raised his face and furrowed his brows. He then raised his right hand and viciously slapped it down toward the Empress Dowager's old face. A crisp slap rang out. This sound was even louder than the slap the Empress Dowager had given Fan Xian earlier. The Empress Dowager covered her face in disbelief. A trickle of blood seeped out from the corner of her lips. The old woman's teeth had probably been knocked loose. Everyone in the hall looked at this scene dumbfounded. It was as if this slap had not only landed on the Empress Dowager's face, but also on their own faces and hearts. Who was the one Fan Xian had slapped? It was the Empress Dowager, the Emperor's birth mother, and Fan Xian's grandmother. Yet, Fan Xian dared to slap her. This was a humiliation that could never be erased. Fan Xian had slapped the Empress Dowager. This proved that he had thrown caution to the wind. If he dared to slap you, he dared to kill you. Fan Xian stared at the Empress Dowager's half-swollen face and quietly said, "Let her go. Stop. I don't want to repeat myself a second time." The Empress Dowager was so angry that her entire body trembled. She also felt a glimmer of coldness that came from the depths of the earth. She knew that in the end, she had still underestimated this grandson whose surname was not Li. She had underestimated his coldness and valiant state of mind. She felt the sword on her neck tighten a little more. Perhaps it was only a moment, or perhaps a long time, but the Empress Dowager's gaze finally became a little desolate. She opened her mouth and said, "Do as he wishes. The Empress Dowager will call it personally." "Speak louder," Fan Xian said. The Empress Dowager stared angrily at Fan Xian. She had no choice but to use her old voice to call out to the outside of the hall, "Guards, listen up. All of you stop." For some reason, once the Empress Dowager's edict came out, everyone in the hall let out a breath. Perhaps Fan Xian's behavior had made these people too afraid. They were deathly afraid of witnessing the terrifying scene of a grandson killing his grandmother and an official killing the Empress Dowager. Only Eunuch Ho, who had his hands around the third prince's throat, furrowed his brows slightly. No one knew what he was thinking. "It looks like Eunuch Ho wants you dead," Fan Xian said coldly to the Empress Dowager. The Empress Dowager glanced at Eunuch Ho. The four old eunuchs furrowed their brows and took a step toward Eunuch Ho. Eunuch Ho sighed and loosened his grip. The third prince's terror had not yet settled. The wound he had been stabbed by the assassin in the afternoon began to bleed again. He quickly supported his mother and ran behind Fan Xian in a panic with Lady Ning. Once the Empress Dowager's edict came out, the sounds of fighting surrounding Hanguang Palace immediately disappeared without a trace. It was clear that the swordsman who had followed Fan Xian into the palace had long received instructions. As long as the guards did not attack, they did not take the opportunity to counterattack. All of the large wooden doors in Hanguang Palace were pushed open at the same time. With a creak, the entire palace became transparent. The people inside the hall could clearly see the tense situation outside. They could see the guards holding straight knives surrounding Hanguang Palace and the countless bodies lying on the empty ground outside the hall. The early autumn night wind also blew in from outside the hall. It was cold and heavy, but it did not allow one to be calm. Following this wind, the smell of fresh blood also entered the hall and rushed straight into everyone's noses. Dozens of black-clothed 6th Bureau swordsmen retreated into Hanguang Palace as quickly as possible and surrounded the eunuchs in the hall. A few powerful old eunuchs of the internal court had no choice but to accept this sullen reality as they were shackled by the Overwatch Council's special metal fingers. The Empress Dowager was in Fan Xian's hands. Fan Xian had already proven that he dared to kill the Empress Dowager. Under such circumstances, how could these internal court aces resist? Even someone like Eunuch Ho, who wanted to resist, was forced by the situation and could not make too many unnecessary movements. Fan Xian looked at his subordinates covered in wounds. His brows twitched again. With a sweep of his gaze, he knew that although the time of the attack outside Hanguang Palace was very short, there were still a dozen loyal subordinates who had died just like that. It was impossible to break into the royal palace without people dying. To be able to temporarily control Hanguang Palace by paying such a small price was already an impossible mission. Fan Xian lowered his eyes and said to the Empress Dowager under his sword, "You know, I won't kill you. If I only wanted to kill you, I have countless ways to make you die without even knowing how you died." The Empress Dowager coughed violently and held her chest. Her neck had been scraped by Fan Xian's sword, leaving a bloody mark. Seeing this scene, the eunuchs and serving girls loyal to the Empress Dowager revealed terrified expressions. They wanted to go forward and serve her, but they didn't dare to move. The Empress Dowager turned her head and stared at Fan Xian with a venomous gaze. "You are the same as your mother, with wild ambitions. I want to see what you can do holed up in the royal palace." Even if Fan Xian had captured the Empress Dowager and controlled the royal palace, what should he do next? Everyone, including the black-clothed swordsman, stared at him, waiting for his next order. Fan Xian was waiting for news from the other 3 groups in the royal palace. He was also waiting for movement in the royal palace. He knew that success had not completely arrived. If things went wrong, his people would fail on the verge of success. While he was waiting, he did not remain idle. He glanced coldly at Eunuch Ho, who was surrounded by the swordsmen. Eunuch Ho's heart trembled. He secretly circulated his zhenqi. Fan Xian nodded. Eunuch Ho paled in shock. He flipped his sleeves and prepared to fight. Unexpectedly, when he raised his eyes, he saw a dozen little crossbows flashing with a black light pointed at him. Fan Xian had put a lot of effort into disguising the 200 people he had brought into the palace because he was afraid of alerting enemies outside the palace. It was impossible for everyone to carry crossbows. Only the dozens of people following him carried 10 hidden crossbows. At this moment, these hidden crossbows were pointed directly at Eunuch Ho. Eunuch Ho roared. His body suddenly rose, but he only rose a foot before his entire body became a porcupine. The 10 crossbow bolts pierced deeply into his body, sucking blood endlessly from his body. With a thud, Eunuch Ho fell to the ground and twitched a few times. He opened his eyes, unwilling to close, and died. Fan Xian looked at this scene coldly. Although he didn't know that Eunuch Ho was the eldest princess' trusted aide, intuition and the scene earlier made him wary. That was why he had suddenly acted and ordered his subordinates to suddenly shoot Eunuch Ho to death. At such a critical moment, Fan Xian was not afraid to kill. He would rather kill wrongly than miss out. Eunuch Ho's death startled the palace into an uproar. The situation, which had just calmed down, became chaotic again. The guards surrounding the palace also became nervous and moved a few steps closer in the direction of Hanguang Palace. Fan Xian did not panic. He slowly removed the sword from the Empress Dowager's neck and swept his gaze across the scene. Wherever his gaze landed, no one dared to look directly at him. They all lowered their heads. He sat down beside the Empress Dowager and lowered his head to circulate his qi. Listening to the clamor in various places in the royal palace, he knew that the three groups must have also encountered powerful resistance. Fortunately, his sudden entry into Hongguang Palace had attracted the most eunuch aces and most of the guards in the rear palace. Jinggu and the other two groups should have it a little easier. It was completely silent in Hongguang Palace. Fan Xian and the Empress Dowager sat side by side on the bed. The grandfather and grandson were both stained with other people's blood and chilled their hearts. Such a scene of grandfather and grandson calmly sitting next to each other chilled the hearts of all who saw it. The guards outside the palace had not disarmed. Fan Xian did not have extra people to carry out such an important task. All of the black-clothed swordsmen had already returned to the palace. He did not want the situation to change at all. The problem of the internal guards should be handed to him to deal with after the great prince dealt with the problem of the royal palace guards. He only waited. He believed in the strength of his subordinates and the Black Knights. He didn't wait for long. A clamor suddenly arose among the internal guards outside the palace. It seemed that something shocking had happened at the back of the camp. Fan Xian did not rise. He said to the Empress Dowager beside him, "Have them make a path." The Empress Dowager's white hair hung by the side of her blood-stained face. The half of her face that was not blood-stained had been swollen by Fan Xian's heavy slap. She looked unusually wretched. Listening to Fan Xian's words, she glanced outside with her listless eyes and nodded. The head of the guards looked at the situation inside the palace. Gritting his teeth, he opened up a gap in the encirclement. A dozen black-clothed assassins carrying a disheveled concubine walked into Hongguang Palace. Fan Xian looked at the number of people and his heart thumped. He knew that even more people had died in this group. After he saw the glimmer of panic in the concubine's beautiful face, he couldn't help but feel his heart jump. The one who came was Lady Shu, the second prince's birth mother. Ever since the Empress Dowager had decreed that the crown prince had succeeded the throne and the second prince had submitted, the Empress Dowager had sent the crown prince, the empress, the eldest princess, and Lady Shu back to their respective palaces to live. She only left Yi Gui-pin, her son, and Lady Ning in Hongguang Palace. Fan Xian gazed at Lady Shu and smiled warmly. He patted the soft bed beside him and said, "Your Highness, please sit here." Lady Shu had been fond of poetry and books since a young age. Her temperament was light. Usually, her relationship with Fan Xian in the palace was considered good. Because of the second prince's matter, there had not been much animosity between them. She was also a taciturn person who was wise to protect herself. Fan Xian did not have much ill feelings toward her. However, in the sudden attack on the palace tonight, she was someone he had to control. Lady Shu had been kidnapped by assassins. She had thought she was going to die, but she had guessed who had done such a treasonous thing. Looking at Fan Xian's face, she couldn't help but feel a wave of terror rise in her heart. She couldn't even say the angry words she had prepared earlier. She looked at the Empress Dowager's wretched appearance and felt a chill in her heart. She could only shrink back and sit by Fan Xian's side. The first to be captured was Lady Shu. This was within Fan Xian's expectations. The defenses of the Eastern Palace and Guangxin Palace were second only to Hongguang Palace. They were also important places. His subordinates would not have been able to succeed so quickly. So, when he saw the silver-masked Jinggu lead his subordinates into Hongguang Palace with a silent expression, his heart sank. He knew things were troublesome. The matter was indeed troublesome. Jinggu lowered his head and said something by Fan Xian's ear. Fan Xian's expression grew heavier and heavier. It was as if there was a giant rock weighing thousands of kilograms between his brows, making it difficult to relax. Another subordinate reported back. It was still bad news. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and rubbed them forcefully. It was as if he wanted to chase away the worry in his heart. A moment later, he sighed and quietly said something to the person on the bed. I had wanted to have a family reunion. Looks like that won't be possible. On the bed sat the Empress Dowager and Lady Shu. Behind him sat Yi Guipin, Lady Ning, and the third prince. Most of the people of the royal family were on this bed. Fan Xian controlled the life and death of the two people beside him in the most absolute close range, protecting the three people behind him. The so-called family was the emperor's family. Now that the Qing emperor had passed away, other than the 6 people on the bed, there was also the crown prince, the empress, and the eldest princess in Guangxin Palace. Fan Xian unconsciously excluded the gardener because he felt that King Jing was much cleaner than everyone else in the family. The heavy rocks between Fan Xian's brows were the 3 members who had not come for the family reunion. The news Jing Gu and the other group had reported was that the Eastern Palace and Guangxin Palace were completely empty. For some reason, the eldest princess and the crown prince seemed to have received the news ahead of time. Just a moment before Fan Xian's subordinates killed their way into the palace, they took advantage of the dark night and fled in the direction of the cold palace in the north. Jing Gu and the hundreds of assassins did not catch up. Such a violent and wanton surprise attack had not captured the most important figures. Fan Xian's mood was unusually heavy, but his expression gradually warmed. Although he had not completely succeeded in breaking into the palace this time, he had, after all, captured the Empress Dowager and Lady Shu. There was never anything perfect in this world. He knew that his luck was not good enough to use 200 people to change the course of history. The Empress Dowager sitting by his side suddenly said in an old voice, I know what you want to do. However, my edict has long been sent down. It was clear that everything Jing Gu said next to Fan Xian's ear had landed in the Empress Dowager's ears. A glimmer of mockery flashed through her eyes. Looking at Fan Xian, she said, Chengqian has left the palace with my edict. Tomorrow, the army will enter the capital. Are you afraid? My courage grows every day. Otherwise, I wouldn't have dared to slap your face until it's swollen. Fan Xian looked at the Empress Dowager with a slight smile. The coldness in his words made one shiver. The Empress Dowager's pupils constricted. The Empress Dowager can have many edicts, Fan Xian said gently to the Empress Dowager. For example, the 13 city gate guards are still under your control. As long as you send down another edict to close the city gates, how will the Qin family come in? I think you know that the trusted aide the eldest princess placed in the city gate guards was killed by someone I sent last night. I am helping you firmly control the 9 city gates. Of course, my goal is to control you. These words came out of Fan Xian's thin lips. They were particularly gentle and terrifying. The Empress Dowager was so angry that her entire body trembled. She glared at him but couldn't say a single word. Although you are already 70 or 80 years old, you are still afraid of death. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and looked at the Empress Dowager as if he was looking at something that annoyed him. Thus, you will have to send down this edict. The Empress Dowager coughed and glanced at Lady Ning behind her. She then turned her head to stare into Fan Xian's eyes and said, even if that barbarian helps you, the most you can do is control the royal palace. What can you do outside the palace? Fan Xian stared back into her eyes and said, I only brought 200 people into the palace. It's not that I am confident. I left 1,700 people outside the palace. What do you think I can do outside the palace? Some distance away from Hanguang Palace, at the intersection of the rear palace and the front palace, a loud cry for killing suddenly exploded out, as well as the sound of the palace doors exploding. Fan Xian listened quietly. He knew that the great prince's imperial army had finally arrived. His heart relaxed. He stood and ordered Jinggu, "I hand Hongguang Palace to you. No matter who it is, if they make any strange movements, kill them." Jinggu accepted the order without any objection. The silver mask on his face shone with a chilling light. Everyone in the palace looked at this person. They didn't know what his identity was for him to accept Fan Xian's seemingly rebellious order so calmly. If it was a normal Overwatch Council official, they would probably feel some fear in their hearts. They didn't know that this deputy commander of the Black Knights had once picked on the eldest son of the Qin family in the military camp. He had stayed in the Qin kingdom's death prison for a long time and suffered countless torments. He had always been a rebellious person, which was why Fan Xian dared to hand him such a rebellious matter. At this moment, Lady Ning suddenly lowered her head and said, "Let me borrow your dagger for a while." Fan Xian glanced at her and smiled. He knew that Lady Ning was afraid that if something truly went wrong, Jinggu wouldn't dare to act against the Empress Dowager. She, the Dongyi female prisoner of war and the child in her belly who had almost been killed by the Empress Dowager, had been waiting for this opportunity with a fierce and hot-blooded nature. Fan Xian nodded at her and then walked toward the darkness outside Hongguang Palace. He was going to Guangxin Palace and the Eastern Palace to investigate. He kept feeling that this matter revealed a very strange message. With a clang, he slid the blood-stained sword back into the sword case on his back and walked down the stone steps of Hongguang Palace. The trusted aides of the Qinian unit who had followed him into the palace followed 3 steps behind him and also walked down the stone steps. Everyone inside and outside the palace watched him. They didn't know where he was going at such a critical moment. Leading a few subordinates, he calmly walked out of the palace. He walked past the internal guards holding weapons pointed at him as if they were facing great chaos. He didn't even blink. The guards did not dare make a move. They could only watch as he disappeared into the black clothes outside Hongguang Palace. Although the Empress Dowager was in the palace, Fan Xian's calmness and bravery shocked the hearts of many people. Fan Xian did not purposely suppress the Empress Dowager's arrogance. The words he said earlier were not false. When he and Yan Bingyun had made the plan in the boudoir of Lady Sun Pin, of the Jingdo government, he had already calculated how much power he could contact. The secret agents the Overwatch Council could move in the capital, the spies hidden in various manners, and the first bureau Fan Xian controlled could still move 1,400 people, even excluding the square building monitored by the internal court and the military. Through the Jingdo government, the 500 Black Knights hidden outside Jingdo entered the capital in disguise. Thus, the power Fan Xian could use reached 1,900 people. Furthermore, these 1,900 people were all skilled in working in the dark. Although they were far from a match for the military in terms of martial power, they were a handy weapon when it came to plotting and rebellion. Fan Xian only brought 200 people into the palace tonight. It was not that he was arrogant. For a sudden attack like this, which focused on speed and surprise, the number of people was never the key. Furthermore, he had to leave a large portion of his power outside the palace. The remaining 1,700 people were doing all kinds of work under Yan Bingyun's orders. Jingdo was too big. Fan Xian had to take care of too many things. He handled the outside of the palace himself. Inside the palace, he had to rely on the thousands of imperial soldiers to control the situation. When the cries of killing came from the rear palace, he knew that the great prince had already taken control of the imperial army. The imperial army's actions were just as the great prince had said to his trusted officer. The timing of their attack depended on the progress of Fan Xian's advance into the palace. When Fan Xian's brave subordinate stopped his steps in the encirclement of guards and sent out the signal arrow toward the night sky and bright moon, the imperial army moved. The signal arrow was bright. In an instant, it lit up half of the royal palace. This kind of signal arrow used to send messages was not the kind the Jingdo garrison and Overwatch Council often used, but it already gave a clear signal. The Great Prince stood beside the city-guarding crossbow and looked at the signal arrow slicing through the night sky. The lines on his face suddenly hardened. Raising his right hand, he chopped down like a knife. It chopped down into the empty night wind at the corner tower of the royal palace. A knife chopped down and directly cut the necks of 2 soldiers on the bed at the same time. Fresh blood sprayed onto the wall with a splash. Unusually bloody, the attack created 2 large flowers of blood. The knife-wielding Imperial Army general who attacked in the night pulled back his long knife and roared, "Kill!" In the dark night, countless people surged into the streets beside the square in front of the royal palace. Silently, they entered the large rooms and began a bloody massacre. A total of 600 Imperial Army soldiers who had been switched to rest were still asleep. Many of them had lost their lives just like that. Some of them had been startled awake, but before they could react, they were greeted with merciless sabers and spears. Those who killed and those who were killed were all fellow soldiers. If this was a different time and place, perhaps they would fight shoulder to shoulder with the Hu people. Drinking hot knives and rubbing their shiny knives, they would bravely kill their way into the enemy camp, blocking arrows and knives for each other. However, tonight was not like that. It was only one side facing the other, an unusually merciless massacre. Before long, the 2,000 Imperial soldiers loyal to the Great Prince had cleaned up a large area in front of the royal palace. Countless corpses and fresh blood mixed together. The stench of blood rose to the sky. The expressions of the Imperial soldiers were not good. They were usually part of the Western Expedition Army. This was the first time they had killed their own people. However, they also knew that these people were not on their side. What they had done tonight did not allow them to show the slightest bit of weakness. They had seen the royal seal sent by the commander and the emperor's posthumous edict, so they had hot blood and faith in their hearts. We are on the side of justice. Right now, they were still alive. Who could say otherwise? After returning home, I have been writing for 3 consecutive days. I am really tired. Tomorrow, I will write less to rest. As for writing, please rest assured. Of course, I am not writing. Cough, cough, I am really ashamed. Chapter 555. One arrow pierced through the clouds, and thousands of soldiers and horses came to meet. When that dazzling firework bloomed in Jingdo's silent night sky, although it was only for a moment, it shocked countless people. The internal purge of the Imperial Army was the first work to begin. Before long, the Great Prince successfully controlled all of the power. The 3,000 or so Imperial Army soldiers left in Jingdo became the most powerful military force protecting the royal palace. At the same time, the Overwatch Council subordinates hidden in the darkness also saw this firework. They revealed themselves from the darkness and began to advance toward their respective targets. The Yamen of the Ministry of Justice had always been sinister, particularly on a night like this. In the silence, a wave of hurried footsteps suddenly rang out outside the Ministry of Justice. The bailiffs responsible for the night watch watched the movement outside the Yamen with astonishment. They then discovered with astonishment that a large group of people wearing black official robes were pressing toward the Ministry of Justice. The bailiffs' faces were deathly pale. They immediately sounded the gong to warn the people in the Ministry of Justice, as well as the prison guards at the back of the Ministry of Justice. They immediately retreated toward the Yamen of the Ministry of Justice because they knew that these black official robes were from the Overwatch Council. They were not a match for them. The sound of the warning rang out. The subordinates of the Ministry of Justice all hurried to the back. Everyone knew that the Ministry of Justice's prison was of the utmost importance. The Crown Prince did not dare to imprison the civil officials who opposed his ascension into the Overwatch Council's prison and had locked them all up there. Although these people were only prisoners in the Ministry of Justice, when they were placed in court, they were officials that even the Empress Dowager had to be wary of. There were not many terrifying sounds of killing. After a few wretched cries and a wave of chaos, the Overwatch Council's 300 or so people entered the depths of the Yamen of the Ministry of Justice and charged into the large square. The bailiffs of the Ministry of Justice and prison guards were surrounded in the center by Overwatch Council officials. The disheveled main official of the Ministry of Justice looked at this scene and couldn't help his heart becoming cold. The two sides had about the same number of people. It seemed that they had the power to fight. However, this minister, who was like the commander of the imperial army and did not dare to go home and only guarded the prison in the Ministry of Justice, could not summon any thought of resistance. The black-clothed men held crossbows in their hands. They were the Overwatch Council officials that Qing officials feared the most. The minister knew that since the Overwatch Council dared to act so wildly, Xiaofan Jr. must have begun to stir up a bloody storm inside Jingdo. The remaining power of the Overwatch Council still existed, and Fan Xian's dark name intimidated everyone's hearts. Without the help of the eldest princess power, not many people dared to directly oppose this group. Moreover, he had also heard that a signal arrow had been fired from the palace. Then, he woke up in a panic and clearly heard the heaven-shaking battle cries that soared into the sky from the imperial city. He didn't know that it was the imperial army, but he knew that there was a change in the imperial city. A number of corpses lay scattered on the field. The leading official of the Overwatch Council looked coldly at the surrounded Minister of Justice. Enunciating each word, he said, "I have come by the Empress Dowager's edict and Prince Heching's military order to bring the old officials out of prison. I would have to trouble you, Minister, to hand them over." Hand them over? No, this was a prison break. The Minister of Justice trembled and didn't dare to speak or curse. Last night, one of his right-hand assistant ministers had died in this hall without anyone knowing. No one knew how the assistant minister had died. The minister didn't want to become a second wronged person. If he surrendered, would he have a chance to live? The light of the torch made the Minister of Justice's expression strange. Seeming to guess his thoughts, the leading Overwatch Council official stared into his eyes and said, "The Empress Dowager has said that all those who have rebelled will be forgiven if they truly repent." The Minister of Justice smiled bitterly. He had even brought up the Empress Dowager's edict. It looked like the Duke of Donbua had already taken control of the royal palace. There was still no news from the eldest princess side. Something had probably gone wrong. With such a situation, why should he bitterly hold on? In a flash, he suddenly thought that if the battle in the royal palace had not been resolved and Fan Xian had not gained the upper hand, if he surrendered so easily, how would he explain it to the crown prince and the eldest princess? The Minister of Justice gritted his teeth. His gaze changed endlessly. The Overwatch Council official looked at him coldly and didn't continue to communicate with him. He slowly raised his right hand. Some of the hundreds of Overwatch Council officials around him raised their crossbows. Some pulled out metal drills. They began to prepare to attack the heavy doors of the Ministry of Justice's prison. On the count of 3. The Overwatch Council official counted expressionlessly. 3, 2, wait. The Minister of Justice was finally crushed by this monotonous count. In a hoarse voice, he yelled, "Wait! I want the Duke of Donbua's words." A mocking smile rose to the corners of the Overwatch Council official's lips. In such a dangerous situation, the Minister of Justice's courage had been crushed. He had not become stupid. He knew that the Empress Dowager's edict was only a piece of broken paper. What could truly save his life was the commissioner's will. He took out a document he had prepared a long time ago and tossed it over. The Minister of Justice picked it up from the ground. Using the dim light of the torch, he read the document again and confirmed that it was the decree personally written by Xiaofan Jr. No one knew when this decree had been written or prepared, but it clearly said that the eldest princess and the crown prince had conspired with Dongyi and northern Qi assassins to assassinate the emperor on Dong Mountain. Each crime was clear. At the back, it said that the governor of the northern expedition camp, Yan Xiaoi, was involved in the rebellion and had been personally executed by Fan Xian. The crime was not important. What the Minister of Justice cared about was the last words. Reading to the end, his expression finally eased a little. In this document, titled "Summon the Imperial Edict to Punish the Traitors," there were about 400 words in total. In the last 100 words, it clearly said that the officials in court had been deceived by Li Qingqian. As long as they repented and performed meritorious deeds for the new throne, the past would be forgiven. The Minister of Justice's hand trembled as he held the decree. This decree did not have the Empress Dowager's seal, but it had the Emperor's royal seal. The most important thing was that Fan Xian had personally made his signature on it. The Minister of Justice knew that at a time like this, no royal seal would be more effective than Fan Xian's signature. Furthermore, he believed that Fan Xian was not someone who would go back on his word. His face grew increasingly pale. He glanced at the Ministry of Justice Yamen guards around him who were summoning up their courage but had ashen faces. He lowered his head and knelt in front of the Overwatch Council official. In a wretched voice, he said, "I plead guilty. Disarming, finger-binding, leashing." All of the Ministry of Justice's armed forces were brought under control in a very short amount of time. It was just that this group of people left some face for the minister, except for the official robe and the black gauze that he was not wearing properly. All kinds of knives, spears, and sticks were piled in the corner. All of the officials of the Ministry of Justice had their arms bound behind their backs with special steel finger cuffs made by the Overwatch Council. These finger cuffs were all tied together with sturdy hemp ropes. They were like grasshoppers strung together during a famine. All of these actions appeared particularly familiar and fast. From the day the Overwatch Council Yamen was born, they had used these methods to deal with the various Yamens of the Qing Kingdom's enormous state apparatus. It could not be said that the Minister of Justice was timid or the Qing Kingdom's Yamen were useless. However, it had been many years. The terror of the Overwatch Council had been deeply rooted in the hearts of all Qing officials. Like a natural enemy, the officials faced this group of black-clothed people could not muster up any courage to resist. After the Qing Emperor died and Chen Pingping was poisoned, the Overwatch Council, this terrifying royal secret service had become the sharpest blade in Fan Xian's hands. While dealing with the remaining affairs of the Ministry of Justice, the two heavy doors of the Ministry of Justice had long been opened. Overwatch Council officials entered and split off many people to help out 40 or 50 wretched-looking officials. These officials did not have time to remove their official robes, but they were already covered in wounds. From this, one could see how hurried and chaotic the Crown Prince had been when he had arrested these officials in Taiji Palace. Many of the officials had no strength to walk after being punished. With the support of these Overwatch Council officials, they were barely able to move out of the door of the Ministry of Justice prison. The eyes of the leading Overwatch Council official narrowed. He quickly walked forward and knelt on one knee in front of these officials. Making a heavy bow, he said in a low voice, "I am the head of the Second Bureau of the Overwatch Council, Murong Yen. On the Empress Dowager's orders, I have come to welcome you. Thank you for your hard work." The civil officials who had been helped out looked at this black-clothed Overwatch Council official and couldn't help but feel a mixture of emotions. They couldn't say anything. Murong Yen did not rise. Instead, he turned and bowed solemnly to the two leading officials. In a low voice, he said, "The commissioner has ordered me to thank the two scholars on his behalf." These two officials were the two first-level officials who had courageously rebelled in Taiji Palace and forcefully stopped the Crown Prince's ascension. They were the heads of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, Hu the scholar and Sir Shu Wu. There were still wounds on Shu Wu's face. Looking at this official, he sighed. He did not feel much joy at having escaped. There was only a deep worry for the situation in Jingdo. He knew Fan Xian's personality. Since he had risked his life to break into the prison tonight, the royal palace would certainly be in chaos. The emperor, who knew how many of the emperor's relatives would die in this storm? Hu the scholar smiled and said, "The Duke of Danbua is wrong. I did not help him." Where is the word thanks? Murong Yen was surprised by these words. There was no time to explain the situation in the palace in detail. 10 carriages had already arrived outside the Ministry of Justice. They took the injured officials into the carriages and headed toward the royal palace. The situation in Jingdo was still very dangerous. These officials who had just escaped prison could not return to their manners for now. Watching the carriages under the Overwatch Council's protection move along the long street toward the royal palace, Murong Yen, standing outside the door of the Ministry of Justice, finally let out a big breath. Although there were still many things he needed to take care of in the Ministry of Justice yamen behind him, his heart had already calmed down. He was the head registrar of the Second Bureau. Originally, he was responsible for gathering intelligence. In the Overwatch Council incident, he had been given the task of forcefully attacking the Ministry of Justice by Sir Yen Jr. Perhaps he had taken a liking to his calmness. It was not difficult to forcefully attack the Ministry of Justice. What was difficult was to rescue the officials in the prison unharmed. Murong Yen knew this very well. Otherwise, the commissioner would not have given him hundreds of people when Jingdo had so few people. The specific mission had been given by Yen Bingyun, but the requirements had been personally drawn up by Fan Xian. Fan Xian had given a death order to the Ministry of Justice prison. He wanted to ensure the safety of the scholars Hu and Shu, as well as the civil officials. He knew that if these courageous civil officials had not risen up in Taiji Palace and forcefully delayed the Crown Prince's ascension, throwing court politics into chaos and Jingdo into chaos, it would have been difficult for him to find an opportunity to successfully break into the palace. These civil officials, who did not seem to have much power other than opening their mouths to remonstrate, were the true heroes of Fan Xian's mission. Fan Xian had borrowed the bones of these officials, so he had to ensure that their bones were unharmed. This was gratitude and a faint sense of guilt. When the Ministry of Justice prison was opened, the Jingdo government, which had seemed even more difficult to attack, had its main doors wide open and brightly lit. It appeared very strange. The Jingdo government was responsible for Jingdo's security and had many bailiffs and officials under its command. When the signal arrow for the fireworks outside the royal palace rang out, the serious-looking second-level official, the Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, walked into the main hall with a heavy expression. His subordinates, who didn't understand what had happened, looked at the magistrate with wide eyes and tongues tied. They wondered why Sir Sun was still wearing his official robes so late at night. After a few breaths, the sound of footsteps arrived like thunder. Sun Jingxiu glanced at his subordinates with a complicated expression and sighed with great regret. He ordered his subordinates to open the main doors of the Jingdo government. Once the doors opened, the officials of the Overwatch Council filed in. Under the gazes of the Jingdo government officials, they took up advantageous positions in the main hall and surrounded Sun Jingxiu in the center. The black-robed Overwatch Council officials parted and a person walked out. It was the head of the first bureau of the Overwatch Council, Mu Tai. This steel-faced official looked coldly at Sun Jingxiu and asked, "Sir, you have ordered me to ask you, have you thought it through?" Sun Jingxiu sighed again. After a moment of struggle, his legs seemed to suddenly lose strength. With a bang, he knelt to the ground and said in a low voice, "I know my mistake, but I do not dare to ask for your forgiveness." After this scene appeared, the entire scene burst into an uproar. Everyone felt incomparably shocked. They didn't understand why the magistrate, who had been carrying out the Empress Dowager's edict and desperately trying to capture Fan Xian in Jingdo, would not resist when the Overwatch Council officials arrived and just surrender. Mu Tai's expression remained like steel. It was as if he had not moved, but he was also incomparably shocked in his heart. He had come under orders to stabilize the Jingdo government. He had thought he was going to face the most tragic battle of his life. Unexpectedly, Yan Bingyun had only lightly given him an order and had him come like this. Entering the Jingdo government, he saw the manor filled with light. Mu Tai had thought he had fallen into an ambush. Unexpectedly, the situation was just as Sir Yan Jr. had said. It had gone surprisingly smoothly. Sun Jingxiu knelt on the ground with an unusually pale expression. His left hand held the black gauze in his arms. He thought that he had been forced. Putting aside whether or not the Jingdo government could resist the Overwatch Council, the conversation with the white-clothed man in the front and back gardens had left him with no way out. He could only surrender. It was not until tonight that he learned that Fan Xian had been hiding in his manor for a number of days. The place of the change in Jingdo was in his back garden, in his daughter's room. Of the assassins who broke into the palace, 400 had used the Jingdo government's documents to sneak into Jingdo. As long as this matter was revealed, no matter how he performed tonight, he would not be tolerated by the crown prince or the eldest princess. They would certainly think he was a spy on Fan Xian's side. Thus, he had no other choice. He could only make a difficult decision and completely lean toward Fan Xian. In any case, people would think he was Sir Fan Jr.'s man, so he might as well become Sir Fan Jr. At least he could survive. His future, safety. Pin would probably speak up for him, right? Thinking of this, Sun Jingxiu's blood involuntarily surged. He was so angry he almost fainted. The documents and precautions for the assassins who broke into the palace to enter the capital had all been sent out from his study. Other than Pin, who else could fake his handwriting and use his official seal without being suspected by his subordinates? In his next life, he would never have a daughter. Daughters would always side with outsiders. The Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, who had been forced to turn traitor, thought with incomparable sorrow. Not long after the battle in the royal palace ended, a large group of imperial soldiers forced their way into the back of the palace through the front door. In front of thousands of tiger-wolf-like soldiers, the already frightened internal court guards and eunuchs wisely chose to surrender. Even if there were some stubborn ones, they became corpses under the sweep of the imperial soldiers. The back of the palace temporarily recovered its silence. One could faintly hear the sound of orderly footsteps and the clatter of armor hitting each other. With a heavy expression, Fan Xian pushed open the main door of the eastern palace and left the swordsmen who had broken into the palace outside. Looking at the dead bodies along the way, he walked into the palace that had just been repaired. In Hanguang Palace, Fan Xian appeared calm. Only he knew how disappointed he was in the depths of his heart. Not capturing the crown prince and eldest princess was the same as tearing a large hole in his plan. A hole that could never be mended. He looked at the eunuchs and serving girls cowering in a circle. A moment later, he silently lowered his head. It was as if he could hear the sound of horse hooves ringing out outside the distant palace walls. He knew this was an auditory hallucination. However, he believed in the speed of the great prince's army. Since the palace was basically under control, he must have already sent out large groups and begun to advance deeper into Jingdo in an effort to control a larger area. However, he would be careful not to come into contact with the 13 city gate guards and cause trouble. The great prince was like him. Since he had taken action, he would not hold back. The Imperial Army and Overwatch Council were doing their best to track the Crown Prince and eldest princess in Jingdo. You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.